boom, just like that. JC Abbott alongside with me, Justin Dunk. Pleasure to have everybody tuning in with you for the 3 Down Nation 2022 CFL Draft live stream. We're going the distance, folks. Every single pick we will have for you on the live stream, not just 2 rounds here. We're going the whole way. JC, we've had multiple trades coming into this day and time already. The Montreal Alouettes are currently on the clock for the number 1 overall pick. They acquired that selection from the Edmonton Elks in a deal that gets the Elks the 4th overall choice in the draft to go along with the 8th overall pick. So they have 2 in the first round. But first, we should talk about the Alouettes. And I feel like it's a foregone conclusion that we know who's going to go number 1 overall.
Yeah, it seems that this is a trade up for Tyrell Richards, the linebacker / defensive end / do-it-all defensive player from Syracuse. He's far and away the top player available in this class that's not in the NFL. Everyone suspected he was a perfect fit for Edmonton, but clearly the Elks have been scared away in some manner because of some of the off-the-field issues that prevented Richards from playing his last NCAA season. And the Alouettes have said, well, that doesn't matter to us. We need Canadian talent at premier positions. Let's go up and grab this guy, essentially just in exchange for the rights to Carter O'Donnell, who is currently under contract with the Indianapolis Colts.
And that's the part of this that is intriguing to me from Edmonton's perspective is, first of all, we should say the Indianapolis Colts have been high from the get-go on Carter O'Donnell. They view him as a guy that has the ability to play tackle in the NFL. He's developed for 2 years. So some people sometimes look at that differently. Well, he's just been on the practice roster. But from the Colts perspective, they put 2 years of development, not only financially, but also their time with coaches into O'Donnell. So they expect him at some point to have the ability to get on the active roster and potentially play. But if you're Jones in this situation, you're thinking, first of all, we get another guy that's from the University of Alberta. I wonder if he's trying to have a entirely U of A offensive line there at some point, maybe down the line. Could be a bit of a stretch, but you roll the dice a little bit, and you mentioned it. If you don't love Richards at 1, if you're Jones, you only have to go back to 4, and you get O'Donnell, who could be a ratio changer. Honestly, he could play left tackle in the CFL, which is ultra rare for a Canadian. But I'm curious, JC, where do you feel Jones could go with the picks that he has in the first round?
What intrigues me is the fact that the Elks moved away from 1, but still added a 2nd pick in the first round. That's intriguing because normally if you're moving out of the top spot, right, that means you don't like the guys available. Clearly, there are multiple players that they covet in this first round. And to me, the first thing that jumps to mind, Chris Jones being the chess master who loves to play with elite athletes, I wonder about the Ford twins, Tyrell Ford, the defensive back, and Trey Ford, the quarterback. 2 guys that I think Chris Jones could do wonders with, both offensively and defensively. Tyrell Ford can be a player that you play at safety and can cover the whole field. He's got the potential to start at corner if you give him some good development. And then Trey Ford, to me, is a little bit similar to Jordan Lynch, who was the 3rd quarterback for the Elks when they were not the Elks, but won the Grey Cup in 2015 under Chris Jones. He had an athletic, mobile quarterback who could play some special teams, who could do some other things, run some unique short yardage packages on his roster. And the way that the Elks have constructed that quarterback room with so many athletic athletes, I wonder if Trey Ford is a guy that they're looking at in this first round.
That's where I'm thinking he's going. You know, Jones is going to have a plan when he makes a trade like this. And if you didn't love Tyrell Richards, which a lot of people thought that he would, and I think he was playing a little bit of bait and switch game when we asked him a couple questions about, have you already decided who you're taking number 1 overall before the draft and obviously before this trade? Do you have an idea who's in that mix? So if this trade is going to be made for the uninitiated out there, Jones is going to make sure when he has that conversation with Danny Machocha, hey, who are you taking at number 1? Because if you want to do this deal, I need to make sure that I'm at least certain that my guy's not coming off the board at 1. And that's why pretty much everybody at this point feels like Tyrell Richards, the linebacker out of Syracuse, is going to go number one. So then Jones is going down his list of guys that he wants. And I think the Ford brothers are right there. Two ultra athletic dudes that have speed that doesn't even just quantify them as Canadians, if you will. That's American type speed. That's honestly, national type speed. You have Trey Ford running at the U Sports Championships in the 60-meter final, and he's a full-time football player as well as a student athlete as well. So these guys, dynamic athletes, and I think you made a great comparison there. They're different in terms of how they play the game, but with what Jones did with Jordan Lynch back in Edmonton when he won a Grey Cup in 2015, that type of guy, you can do that with Trey Ford, but he also has the upside to be a starter in this league, not just because of his athleticism, but the way he threw the ball. So it's a really intriguing pair there. So we've talked about the top of the draft and what Jones has done in terms of those first two first-round picks. Number 2 overall, that seems to be where this draft could pivot, especially in the first round. The Ottawa Red Blacks hold that pick with Sean Burke, their new general manager there. What do you see as options for the Red Blacks at 2?
Where everyone suspects that they're going is their only real need is someone to back up Cleon Lang and potentially eventually take over that role at Canadian defensive tackle. And so the obvious choice there is Deontay Knight from the University of Western, who is an absolute bull in a China shop out there as a pass rusher, rushed off the edge at 278 pounds, but will slide quite comfortably inside at the next level. So that's the obvious selection here at defensive tackle. But because Ottawa's done such a good job, in my opinion, this offseason in adding so many Canadian pieces all over their roster, there's not really any pressing needs. And so for me, I wonder if Trey Ford's a guy who could go here at number 2 as well, because Ottawa doesn't need anyone who can impact immediately. They have a unique offensive play caller in Paul Lapalisse, who we know what he did with Chris Strevler in bringing him in for special packages. And I don't think Trey Ford, in terms of his athleticism, I think he fits well with Jeremiah Mazzoli and Caleb Evans and Tyree Adams and Taron Christian, the guys they already have in that quarterback room, who are all athletic, mobile guys. So Trey Ford seems like a fit for me there. If you're a team that doesn't have any sort of pressing needs, you can take that shot on a quarterback that you're going to take a couple years to develop. So that's really intriguing, because the last time we had a Canadian starter in Ottawa, of course, that was the great Russ Jackson. So those would be some very big shoes to fill for Trey Ford.
And we've talked a lot about Trey Ford, but rightfully so. He's arguably a generational talent in a CFL draft class and was the most athletic quarterback in the NFL draft class. So that's going to play a factor here, because Ford has 2 rookie minicamp invites, one from the Baltimore Ravens, the other one from the New York Giants. Now, it's not just your same old Giants giving out invites to all of the Canadian guys. I believe Ford is the only Canadian going to their rookie minicamp this year. So that tells you that they're looking at him in a more serious manner. And if you're the Ravens, it makes a lot of sense, because you have Lamar Jackson and I believe Tyler Huntley, the backup there, who are athletic dudes. And they signed, I think, J.C., you would know the name for sure, Anthony Brown out of Oregon. And then it's Ford going to rookie minicamp. So he's going to have an opportunity to go there and potentially earn a contract. It's definitely a long shot, but we've seen it in the past where Canadians and also Americans go to rookie minicamps and earn contracts.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. And in normal circumstances, I would say it has almost no effect on your draft status for the CFL, because it so rarely turns into a contract. But a quarterback is not a unique situation here. We don't see that happen. And Trey Ford is exactly the type of person who could go to this type of minicamp and show out, impress, show he has that generational athleticism that will allow him to earn that contract. So that will be in the back of teams' minds if they're turning in that card for Trey Ford.
And that's the difference in my mind, is that it's the quarterback position, and it's a guy that is legitimately a world-class athlete. And we've seen more and more of those types of players getting opportunities in the NFL. And the fact that the Ravens have a couple guys like that, Jackson and Huntley, who played so well when Jackson was injured during the NFL season last year, makes you think, well, the Ravens are going to want to have guys in their system that can run similar types of offenses. It's obviously way down the road and a big projection to think about Ford stepping on an NFL field and playing meaningful reps for Baltimore because they have Jackson there, but stuff changes quickly. So you want to make sure you have that organizational depth of the position. And as far as Canadians going down to NFL rookie mini camps and earning contracts, it's not like it's something that we have not seen before, or at least what it can set up is that familiarity with the player so that down the road, if Ford proves himself in the CFL as a quarterback, he could get a deal. But my recollection of Canadians going down to NFL rookie mini camps and getting a contract goes back to Darryl Watt. He went to the Washington football team's mini camp, ended up agreeing to a contract, never actually went back down, but he impressed enough there to earn a contract. So one of the hardest things to do from a sheer numbers standpoint is just to get that opportunity, JC. And as we talk about Mr. Ford, we'll get to him here in a minute. I'm sure he's going to come off the board pretty soon. We have it official. The Montreal Alouettes and GM Danny Machocha doesn't take a Frenchman, takes Tyrell Richards, the linebacker, D lineman, even took reps at defensive back at the CFL Combine, the first player to take reps at all three positions at the national event, has officially been made the number one overall pick in the 2022 CFL Draft. 6'4", 236 pounds, will instantly be a contributor on special teams, right, JC?
He'll be a demon on the teams. Now, the only thing surprising about this pick is that he's not Quebecois, because everyone in the world knew that Tyrell Richards was going to be the first pick in this year's CFL Draft. You talk about how big he is, that 236 pounds, and he runs a 4.6. He's super explosive. He's got great get off. He's got sideline to sideline range if you want to play him at linebacker. This is a guy who can impact you in a number of different ways, as a primary pass rusher, as a blitzer, as a guy who can drop into coverage. The element with Tyrell Richards that might scare some people off is some off the field issues. So his last year, he did not play his senior season at Syracuse or anywhere in the NCAA. He opted to attempt to transfer, did not allegedly have the academic credits in order to find another landing spot. But the situation at Syracuse before that, there was some issues with the coaches. He was on and off the roster. He had a DUI that caused him to get suspended by the team heading into his junior season. So there's some red flags there. And as a result, the game film that CFL teams were assessing in order to pick Richards is pretty raw. If you look at his junior year tape and before, he played primarily off the edge as an outside linebacker, pass rusher, which might not be the spot you want to project him to at the CFL level. And B, he was athletic, but he didn't really attack with a plan. He was sort of lost at times. He didn't have all the things together in terms of the use of his hands and setting up moves. Super athletic in the sense that he could track a guy across the field if he got away from the block, but wasn't consistently a threat or a high-level player yet at the NCAA level. Now, the thought is that in that senior year, he would have taken that next step, become a dominant force, but you'll never know. And after a year off, you have to be able to project what you think Tyrell Richards will be. Is he that same player, or is he something much better like he showed with a dominant performance at the CFL Combine?
That was the key to me, is that, yes, he had the year off, but he showed up to the CFL Combine, looked in great shape, but more importantly, performed on the field against his highest rated peers in this draft class. So in my mind, after that day, and I remember walking away from the bubble down there at the University of Toronto with you, JC, and our colleague, John Hodge, who's grading the pick. So you should actually have two screens up right now. Hodge's written analysis, and then, of course, keep us going. But we walked away from there and we said, we can't see anybody else than Richards going number one. And it made sense that Jones would take him at one, but also there's always that trade factor. And I mean, rightly or wrongly, people associate some, let's say, rocky pass with guys that Jones like to bring in and have under his wing. But you talk to some people around the league, and Jones has started talking about it himself, that he has really taken more of his draft grade and put it into the character of the player. So there's some people that will tell you that Jones is a little bit spooked because of the uncertainty of Richards off the field. So far, in terms of what he's done, in terms of being in front of CFL scouts and in the meeting rooms, there weren't really many questions, but it's hard to get away from that past and what happened at Syracuse in terms of how some teams viewed Richards overall.
Yeah, you hope he's matured as a person, and those same issues aren't a problem at the CFL level, but you never know. And through the scouting process, all these teams are talking to not only the head coach at Syracuse, but they're talking to, his position coach. They're talking to the strength and conditioning coach. They're talking to the grad assistants, right? They're doing a deep dive on this guy. And if the reports they're hearing back, even if it's 2 years old from when he was a younger, less mature guy, are not favorable, that's going to be something that teams take into account, because you are bringing a person in to your place of employment, right, to create a culture. And if you see red flags there, it can be difficult to gel that with the obvious talent that Tyrell Richards has on the field and has had for his entire life, going from high school to the NCAA and now the CFL.
And scouts will tell you too that, yeah, you're obviously going to talk to the head coach, and in this case, you would talk to the defensive coordinator. But the people you get the best information out of are sort of so-called those people that are the flies on the wall, the video guy, the locker room guy, like a Dwayne Mandrusiak. You know what I mean? The guys that are in and around these people when there's not the eyeballs of the decision makers on them. That's where you get that information of like, okay, what do they really like? It's sort of like in the media. People could be different on camera versus off camera. For us, we're just boys talking ball most of the time anyway, so we're not really different, JC. But that's where the scouts will go to get that information. Now, to be fair and present the other side of it, right? A lot of people in their lives get the opportunity for second chances. So it's not like Richards was a completely terrible human being at Syracuse. It seems like it was potentially some young mistakes. And then you have the people in the league, and clearly the Alouettes feel like this. They can get over that, learn from it, mature, and be better overall. You alluded to this a little bit earlier. So the Alouettes feel like in this situation, it was worth trading up to 1 and giving away the rights to Carter O'Donnell, who maybe they feel like is just going to want to go back to the province of Alberta at some point anyways, because he was born and raised there and went to the University of Alberta. So they can jump up a couple spots, get a player that they know can make an impact right away for them. And honestly, it's a little bit of a position that they could use to help out the special teams, and then you can develop him, ideally, in Montreal's world, to be a starter.
Yeah, he fits what they need perfectly. They need guys on defense that can give them some versatility there. Right now, Chris Aki is the unquestioned starter at that linebacker spot. But behind him, you don't have a lot of quality depth. Now, I love Frederick Plessius. He's a great Canadian player, but he's a little long in the tooth at this point. You want to start looking for someone a little bit younger, and they don't have that guy behind him that can contribute at that will linebacker spot potentially if Aki gets injured, or who can take on that special teams role. And then you add in the versatility that Richards gives you to be able to go with his hand on the dirt or go from a stand-up edge rusher position. And you look at, they don't really have anyone on those edges to get in the rotation as a Canadian if you want to drop an extra American in the defensive backfield or something of that nature, right? They acquired Brock Goenlock this last off season, but other than that, there's no edge rushers on that team who are Canadian. And so Richards fills both holes with his versatility very nicely. And he's a guy who had 8 special teams tackles one season at Syracuse. He's going to be a demon on the teams. He's going to chase down with that 4.6 speed, that 236-pound body that nobody can block, long arms, just demolish returners. I expect him to have double-digit special teams tackles this upcoming season.
Out the gate as a rookie.
Out the gate, he's going to have at least 12, and that might be low.
Ooh, my goodness. I still feel like there's always a little bit of a jump for these guys. And I mean, we should touch on the past in terms of NCAA Canadians being selected number 1 overall, because it's been a little spotty. I mean, if you're a Hamilton Tiger Cats fan, you're probably not happy that Mr. Chapman never showed up to Steeltown. I mean, you can go back and we asked Chris Jones about this, the 2016 draft with Josiah St. John. Although he's still in the league, he hasn't become the bona fide starter that a lot of people thought he would be in that draft. So it's been a little bit up and down in terms of the NCAA Canadians that have gone number 1 overall. But before we get back into Richards a little bit, number 2 overall, a bit of a shocker here, earlier than I think a lot of people would have projected, but one of your favorite players, I know this, JC, in the draft. Number 2 overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks select University of Ottawa offensive lineman Zach Pellihos, 6'6", 304 pounds, and he moves like butter.
Oh, I'm an offensive line coach at the high school level. I played offensive line when I played. Watching Zach Pellihos tape, if you're sitting at home, you feel like you're doing something sinful. You're like looking over your shoulder, checking to make sure no one's going to catch you, because it's absolutely beautiful the way he moves. He's silky smooth at that size. He can go out in space and fit up a linebacker who's twice as athletic as him and drive him into the dirt. He is a special athlete at that size on the move. Now, not a lot of people thought he would go this high. We had him as our number 1 offensive lineman, which a lot of other people didn't. But the developmental traits that he has in terms of his ability to bend, his ability to move, his first step quickness is an offensive line coach's dream. And we talked about how Ottawa doesn't have any immediate pressing needs. And I would say that goes for their offensive line as well. But if you've got no pressing needs, then here is a potential blue chip talent that may need some smoothing out in terms of if he moves inside, his ability to anchor and his technique. But in 2-3 years can be a high-end starter for you along the offensive line. And you have the time and the patience to develop him. And he's a local kid, so he's not going to go anywhere in the near future.
That's the key to me. I mean, even though people think it's a high pick, the upside, the Red Blacks and Sean Burke, their GM, and the scouting staff, and I'm sure even Paul Lapalisse see in Pellihos has to be intriguing. And we were talking, I think all 3 of us were at some point, to Miles Gorell, the Hall of Fame offensive lineman, who himself went to the University of Ottawa and won a Vanier Cup there, loved Pellihos. He was raving about him. And Mr. Gorell is a tough man to please. So I took that away and I thought, if he's raving about this kid, he must be really good, especially with the ties to Ottawa, having been in that GG's program and still the upside. It seemed like a perfect guy for Ottawa to at least target in the first round, because they don't have any pressing needs, because Burke has done such a good job remaking that offensive line on the fly, and then also aiding the Canadian talent across that roster. So I love this pick, JC. I know you're going to be watching Red Blacks games even more intently now.
Absolutely. It's an A+ pick for me. I thought Pellihos would be available later. I'm glad he's the first offensive lineman on the board, because I don't think it's necessarily close between him and the next guy's potential. There is a wide gap in my mind about what the ceiling is for these prospects. Now, right now, he might not be the most pro ready, but in a couple of years, I think he can be a special player. And you talk about his time at the University of Ottawa, and I think one of the special things about Pellihos is this is a guy who missed an entire season of football because of academic issues. He was rendered ineligible, and he battled back from it. He got diagnosed with ADHD. He got himself squared away in the classroom. He worked extremely hard to get back on the field so he could become the starting right tackle for the GGs, and he was the team's MVP last season, Dunk. When was the last time you were on a team where the MVP of the entire team was a right tackle? That's the type of special athlete that Pellihos is. He's just the best player on the field anytime he's out there.
It's never happened before in my career that I was on a team that an O-lineman was the MVP. Not to say that I didn't play with any great ones, but it's definitely a rarity. And Pellihos just has that hard-working attitude. I remember Gregor at the combine pointing out how he was just showing up essentially in like his work boots. He felt like to do some of the jumps and stuff. I mean, he wasn't, but it's just he kind of had that rugged attitude and that ambition that it didn't matter, what he showed up in. He wasn't the flashiest, didn't have those, shiny Nike or Adidas or Under Armour cleats or anything like that, but he's just going to get the job done. But he does it in such a silky smooth way that this pick to me is really intriguing for Ottawa because they have a veteran core of offensive linemen there, but they certainly could use that next wave. And if you go back to the Hamilton Tiger Cats, where Burke was essentially the assistant GM. We won't get into that long title that he actually had, but they just continued to stockpile offensive linemen. They took offensive linemen even when people think they didn't need more offensive linemen because they knew at some point either they were going to leave, ask for more money, or potentially not pan out the way that they thought. So I think this is a very prudent move for the Red Blacks in a number of ways.
Long term, especially, you look at who their projected starters are on that offensive line. You got Darius Sirocco, who's pretty young still at center, but the two guys they've brought in this offseason are Jacob Ruby and Hunter Stewart. Hunter Stewart especially is a guy who's older in his career, who can slot in and help this team right now that desperately needed offensive line help, but maybe won't be there in a couple of seasons. So you need to have that next guy. And they've been stockpiling them. They've got some guys that I really like. Jacob Zott from McMaster a couple years ago, who's a guy at center. Connor Bergloff is a guy I absolutely loved at center. So they've got a couple of guys inside that they're developing as well. And you add Pellihos to that mix, a guy who most people think he's going to play guard, but quite frankly, he moves well enough. You can let him pinch hit a tackle at the next level. I really do believe that. So a fantastic pick in my mind.
And he is 6'6", 304, so he has that size to potentially play outside. And you mentioned it with the way that he moves, so silky that he could at least have that opportunity and provide that flexibility when he gets on the dress roster. Like this pick, I'm sure John Hodge is giving it an A+ in his written analysis, which you can catch on 3downnation.com. You should have two screens open. If you didn't hear us before, you should have Hodge's written analysis, and you should also have us going the entire distance, baby, the whole draft. Now, it seems like a little bit of a holdup here with the Lions pick, but maybe we should tee it up a little bit. BC on the clock, and a lot of people, J.C., you wrote about this, are going to want them to at least take one of the Philpot twins, if not both.
Well, a lot of people would like that, but it looks like that pick just came in, Dunk, and it's another shocker, a massive one. Do you want to tee it up for me, or shall I?
I'll roll, and then we'll get you with the analysis. So the Lions, everyone was talking about them going with the Philpots because they're from that province, but no, they go to the prairies and take Nathan Cherry, defensive lineman, University of Saskatchewan, 6'3", 240, an absolute high motor guy. And this is a position that they stocked up on in free agency, JC. So maybe we'll get to that down the line question in a little bit. But what do you think of Cherry overall, especially going this high?
I think it's a little bit surprising that he goes ahead of Deontay Knight. I mean, we had him below Knight in our rankings as well. But quite frankly, throughout this process, I've had a lot of second thoughts about which one is the better prospect. And I don't think there's very much that separates them. Nathan Cherry is super violent with his hands, and he's way more sophisticated with them than Knight is. He can jack up a guy with strength, or he can hit you with a quick, decisive move and penetrate into the backfield. And you mentioned that motor. He's just a high effort lunch pail type of guy that I think can contribute quite early in his career and has all the tools that you want to develop. Now, the Lions have added a lot of pieces at that defensive end spot because they're going to start a Canadian there with Matthew Betts and David Menard. But the nice thing about David Menard is he can move inside as well. He can play both positions. Nathan Cherry gives you a Canadian guy that you can put at the interior rotation. You can get two American edge rushers for certain packages. which they desperately needed, because right now the only guy they have there is Courtney Hammond, who I believe was a 4th-round pick out of Western Oregon in 2020. They don't have a single other Canadian defensive tackle in that room, but they need a guy who can contribute at that position. Nathan Cherry, to me, is a fantastic pick there.
Is that where you see him playing in the CFL? Is more inside?
I do. He's 271 pounds, right? Which is, you have some versatility to play inside or outside at that size. It's not disqualifying, but he's mostly played inside, and I think that's where he sticks. The strength is not an issue, right? He's a bull strong dude. I think he put up 26 on the bench, and sometimes that gym strength doesn't translate on the field, but I think it does in the case of Nathan Cherry. There are certain reps on tape where he's taking a guy, when he punches and he extends, he doesn't have particularly long arms. They're only about 31 inches, but he's jacking a guy's pads up into his throat and knocking him back because he's got that strength in the interior. I really like his pass rush upside there, his ability to use his hands. It's a guy I thought the Lions might target in the 2nd round. They take him here at 3, which is a bit of a shocker, but I really like the fit.
We touched on the Philpots before the BC Lions card was officially turned in, and it was Cherry. And a lot of people felt like, the Philpots aren't going to get out of the 1st round. But I'm sorry, I've seen it too many times where people talk about receiver going high and then they end up falling. I'm not saying both the Philpots are going to fall here, but everybody thought, this is a prime spot for the Philpots to go to BC at 3 overall. So it just shows you how unpredictable the CFL draft can be, and that sometimes we get big-eyed over the sexy skill positions, and especially receivers potentially coming in and making an impact here. But Cherry, in my mind, I don't necessarily think is overdrafted, because he's a guy that could have that versatility, and he's going to help you out in a position where, you mentioned this a little bit, JC, BC could use some help. They've drafted multiple guys in recent years there, but they haven't really panned out how they projected.
That's true. I mean, they drafted Junior Luke a number of years ago, and he didn't pan out. The kid, Julian Laurent from Georgia State, he didn't pan out. This has been a position they've tried to address for a number of years, and at times have reached for guys. I think Courtney Hammond, who's the guy currently on the roster, was a bit of a reach when they took him a few years ago, because they were so desperate to have a body at this position. And Nathan Cherry, well, some people will say he's a reach, and he might be. To me, he's a much better projection than some of the guys they've taken in terms of his CFL skill set. And I think people are going to love him in BC. I think he's a guy similar to David Menard in the fact that maybe he's never a full-time starter, but he's going to be in your rotation constantly. He's going to be a guy who gets a handful of sacks every single year and is just a core Canadian for your franchise. I really, really like the fit here. And you add in the element of someone like Daniel Joseph, who they took last year in the 1st round, who is a edge defender, but has some size. I think he's 260 pounds, playing in the NCAA. And he doesn't have an NFL contract, which is what he went back to school to get. So he could be potentially coming up here this year as well. So now you've got a Canadian defensive line rotation that has Matthew Betts, a 1st-round pick, Daniel Joseph, a guy who has 9 sacks in a NCAA season playing for NC State, which is a big-time college football program, David Menard, who is the East nominee for most outstanding Canadian last year, and Nathan Cherry, all of whom can contribute and get on the field. That's a pretty fearsome group of Canadian defensive linemen that you've added when you had none a year ago.
That's a pretty big difference. Cherry is ultra physical. I called a number of his games over the years on the Canada West Football Showcase, and shout out Bamboo Shoots, the production company out there, doing a great job highlighting this kid. And he was one of the main reasons why they were able to get to the Vanier Cup, won the Hardy Cup in 2021, and then even went into Montreal and beat the Carabin on their home turf to get to Laval. They ultimately lost to Western, but that was a really physical football game. And it was mainly, in my mind, more about the offense not being able to live up to it for the Huskies overall. That said, Cherry, an ultra physical guy. I've seen him multiple times just dominate and manhandle in the Canada West. And even at times on snaps against Western, who was a physical team and met that physical level against the University of Saskatchewan in the Vanier Cup to take home the 2021 U Sports trophy. So he's a guy right away has that physicality. And a lot of times I feel like that gets overlooked in the CFL. You talk about the flash and dash, and we've talked about Richards and his 40 and his chase down ability and how well Pellihos moves. And the first thing we talk about with Cherry is the physicality, and you need to have that physicality level to succeed in any pro football league.
Absolutely. That physicality is key, and you'll have scouts that tell you, look, I don't care about the stats. I don't care about anything else. Is he physical enough? That's my number one criteria. That's my determining factor. If I don't think the guy is willing to take on the tough jobs, I'm not going to select him. And I think that's especially true for Canadians, because early in your career, you're going to have to do a lot of the dirty work, a lot of those not so nice jobs on special teams or short yardage or in the rotation. Whenever you're going in on the field, it's not necessarily going to be early in your career as that premier guy who's expected to get after the quarterback every single time, make the highlight reel sack, and impact the game in that way. You're doing the stuff that fans aren't necessarily cheering for, but you need to do to win. And Cherry is a guy who can shoulder that burden excellently. Now, I was just going to say that it's interesting that we see here at 3, somebody goes defensive tackle, because I think one of the things holding itself over this entire draft is the supplemental draft coming up here in 2 days' time, where there is 2 defensive tackles available. Jamin Pelly out of the University of Calgary and TJ Ryam out of Boston College, very talented defensive tackles. And so you look at Edmonton that might have needed a defensive tackle, or Ottawa, we discussed potentially being a fit with Deontay Knight earlier. Is it part of their decision-making process to move out of the first pick and in the second pick, not take a defensive tackle because they have that first waiver priority to get one of those 2 guys in the supplemental draft, whereas BC is sitting at 3, knowing they are not as likely to get those 2 guys and can grab a guy like Cherry here?
It certainly makes some sense overall, as the 4th pick has just come off the board. Chris Jones makes his first pick of the draft, not first overall, 4th overall. It might be another one that some people weren't predicting. Enoch Makonzo, defensive back, Coastal Carolina, 5'11", 195, the 4th overall selection to the Edmonton Elks with Jones. This does make some sense because Makonzo is a versatile dude, right, JC?
The most versatile player in this draft by far. So for those unfamiliar with Makonzo, he played at Coastal Carolina in the NCAA. He played a position they call their spur linebacker role. So essentially he's a safety at 5'11", 195 pounds, but he played down in the box or over the slot. He had to cover slot receivers, man-to-man or in zone, or rush off the edge and fill against the run. So he has a very unique skill set in that regard. Didn't play up high at free safety like a lot of the Canadians we see, or even in a traditional strong safety role. He was doing things that you would associate more with a hybrid player. And I think he's actually someone who maybe down the line, his best fit is at Sam linebacker. I wonder if that's a place you can play him, which is something we don't say a lot about Canadian prospects, but Enoch Makonzo is that versatile and he has that skill set. He strikes me as a guy that Jones would love. And maybe this is a bit of opposite day because we thought the Alouettes were going to stick here at 4 and take the Quebecois Makonzo, and the Elks were going to take Tyrell Richards, but they flip-flop and they get the guy that we thought was going to go in those spots regardless. And I think the Elks are going to love Makonzo because of the versatility he gives you and because of the way he plays. He's got this hair on fire style is how I would describe it. Whereas a run defender, especially, he just shoots up field as a force defender, just goes off that edge and disrupts plays. Even if he's not making the tackle, if you watch a Coastal Carolina game, virtually every time there's an outside run, Enoch McConzo is on your screen on the highlight because he shot up there, disrupted it, and let someone else come and make the play. So just a guy that can do that on special teams for you, on defense for you, and playing a variety of roles that Jones is going to love.
He's a feisty dude. I like the way you described him, hair on fire. That doesn't necessarily mean he's out of control. I think it more means how he arrives at the football with a fury almost. And Jones will love that, plus his versatility. And it is ultra rare, as you mentioned, JC, that any Canadian gets mentioned as potentially playing strong side linebacker. But McConzo seems like he could fit that role in an ideal way because of how physical he is, despite his size. Now, he'll need to show that he can potentially run with some guys from the slot, and that will be an adjustment because he'll have to deal with the waggle. But just because he's from Montreal, I think in this case, doesn't necessarily mean that Jones is afraid to take those kind of guys. I think Jones is more of the mind that once he has his guys and when they're on his team and they're with him, his dudes will love him. So they're not necessarily going to leave to go home. I'm not saying it never happens, but in this case, he's just looking at, all right, who's the best pure football player who also happens to play defense in this case that can help out my team? And he felt it was McConzo at 4.
Mm-hmm. And he'll provide some very early versatility or impact to go behind Jordan Hoover at the safety position. My question mark with McConzo, and I talk about that hair on fire style, and you say he's not necessarily out of control. I think sometimes he can be on that brink, on that fine line. And the result occasionally, like his time at Coastal Carolina, was he missed some tackles in space because he doesn't necessarily come to gather all the time exceedingly well. He likes to shoot in there, and sometimes he'll miss a guy. So I wonder if you stick him up at free safety, does that accentuate that problem? Is he shooting out at guys with tons of room around as the last man on defense, missing and allowing a big play? I think that could be a concern, and that's why I like him a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage where he can fill against the run a little bit more and take on that role. But certainly if you work on those fundamentals about breaking down, he's a guy who can play multiple spots in your secondary and linebacking core, which is something that we know Chris Jones likes athletes to do.
And Jones has said publicly that Deron Carter is going to start training camp at safety. So McConzo might not need to pitch in there, at least right now. You can always obviously juggle things around. The 5th overall pick is in. The Calgary Stampeders put the card in, and we have our first Philpot off the board. Jalen Philpot, receiver, University of Calgary, 6'1", 190, goes 5th overall to the Stamps.
And this is a slot where you saw him potentially going because the Stamps love guys who played for the Dinos. That's their favorite thing to draft. And oftentimes, where sometimes teams will see a guy who played for the Dinos that doesn't have ideal size or something like that and take them off the board, the Stampeders are very comfortable and very familiar with all those guys who play in the same stadium as them, and will take those guys who maybe don't have all the ideal measurables. And Jalen Philpot is an elite player who lacks a little bit of size, maybe doesn't have the elite top end speed or a crazy vertical or something like that, but is a fantastic route runner, really explosive in and out of his breaks, changes direction like nobody's business. I got a chance to watch him down in Texas at the College Gridiron Showcase. And let me tell you, when he's running those underneath routes against off coverage and he's driving his stem with the right leverage and then breaking back and running the comeback, I mean, the separation he can get in just a couple steps is crazy. The guy is a great route runner. Now, you wonder about his ability to be as big of a game breaker as he was in college at Calgary. He maybe isn't going to threaten you vertically. And if there's a contested ball, I'm not sure how many of those he's going to win. But there's a lot of zone coverage in the CFL, and there are spots where you can exploit it with a crisp route runner like Jalen Philpot. And Calgary has tried to find a smaller receiver in recent years. We tend to associate them with the big guys like Richie Sindani and Luther Hakunavanahu, but they tried to take Travell Pinto out of UBC 2 drafts ago, which didn't work out because of a very unfortunate off-the-field issue on Pinto's behalf. But Philpot can be that guy and become a starting receiver who's not just a big body blocker or distraction, a guy who can actually catch a bunch of balls in that underneath, across the, crossing routes, short routes, screens, hitches, that type of thing.
We started talking about the Philpots and mentioning, hey, maybe they both go to BC. But what we should have done also and tagged was the fact that you mentioned this multiple times. The Stampeders know that University of Calgary program so well. And both the Philpots were there for 4 years, played right from the get-go, made an impact right from day one when they stepped on campus there with the Dinos, and were dudes that a decent amount of people around the league felt like could do similar things in terms of having an impact right away at the CFL level. That's up for debate. There's other people on the other side of it that felt like, maybe they weren't wanting it enough, I guess would be the way to put it. And they just didn't see that tenacity in them. But these guys just have sort of this cool attitude. They both run so smoothly out there. Jalen is certainly the more explosive athlete in my mind, but they're still two ultra productive receivers. And we'll see if John Hufnagel does some maneuvering here to potentially get Tyson and keep him at McMahon Stadium. But for right now, Jalen Philpot is staying there, a guy that has been productive with multiple quarterbacks there, not just Adam Sinagra, who was a Heck Crichton winner and helped the Dinos win their first Vanier Cup since 1995 when they won the championship in 2019. He also played with Josiah Joseph last season, was ultra productive with him. They did have a lot of practice time together, but it shows me that he wasn't just reliant on a good quarterback, that he creates separation for the guy throwing the ball.
He absolutely does. And I think he's going to be in the mix to start early in his career for the Stampeders. This is a team that likes to have 2 Canadians at the receiver spot. And while Richie Sindani is going to fill up one of those roles, right now it's been Colton Hunchak who's done that a bunch, or they had Michael Klukas a couple years ago who filled that role. And these are not necessarily premier prospects. These are guys who have exceeded their expectations, who are lunch pail guys who can contribute on special teams, but aren't going to necessarily give you big time ability as a receiver. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to Colton Hunchak, but this is a guy who ultimately went with the final pick in his CFL draft, whereas Jalen Philpot is rightfully so a first round receiver who can go into that starting role either on the outside or in the slot for certain routes and contribute right away. You talk about not every team saw the value here, and I agree with that assessment, because if you've got a guy of Philpot's size and his skill set, he's not going to give you a whole bunch on special teams, right? And we talk about that a lot in the CFL draft. He's not going to contribute in that way early. So if your team taking him high, you need to have a clear path for him to see the field on offense. And I think Calgary is one of the few teams in the league that has a very clear path for him to start potentially early in his career.
And it's really intriguing to pair him potentially, if he earns it, with Bo Levi Mitchell slinging the rock at quarterback in the way that Calgary generally likes to get the ball out quickly. It means if Philpot earns a role there, a starter's role, or even makes the dress roster right away, which you would imagine, as you mentioned, if you're going to spend a first round pick on a receiver who's not going to help you on special teams, then you probably at least see him as being capable of making your dress roster. Then Philpot could be a guy who gets targeted early in his career. How early? We'll have to see how he does through training camp and such. But there's a number of Dinos on that roster already, and they're clearly really familiar and comfortable to make that pick at number 5 overall, when usually we tend to see Hufnagel tilt towards the lines and generally offensive line in the first round.
We do. He likes to have bigger bodies. He likes to have guys who contribute on special teams if he's going on a so-called skilled position this early. But Philpot, I think, is the exception because of what he did in that stadium for so long. They saw it up close and personal. You are very comfortable here taking him if you're the Stampeders because you get to see him every day. So you don't have maybe the same concerns that other teams do. Now, the question is, where does his brother fall, who most people have ranked behind Jalen, but not very far? Is he also going to go in the first round? Is there a landing spot for him? Or are we going to see him go at the top of the second round? It'll be intriguing to see where all these twins fall in this draft because there is three sets of identical twins in this year's CFL draft.
Who's the third, JC? We talked about the Fords. We've talked about the Philpots at length right now, but who's the third?
That's a pair of linebackers from Montreal who play at Tuskegee University in the United States, Wesley and Woodley Apollon. They are the third set of twins, guys who were coveted JUCO recruits. Woodley had a cup of coffee with Northern Illinois University, and then eventually they wanted to play together, and they settled at Tuskegee, which is a historically black college and university in the United States, and had tremendous success there at the Division II level.
Intriguing. Three sets of twins go, and I would imagine the Stamps are hoping maybe does Tyson fall to the second round so we can get both those guys. It'd be a really rare thing for Huffnagle to go receiver, but nonetheless, if you're going to bring one in and you know you're going to have a Canadian receiver starting at a couple spots, potentially, maybe you want to have the brother as a backup. The 6th overall pick is in the Toronto Argonauts select Gregor Mckellar, offensive lineman, St. Francis Xavier University, 6'5", 311, a dude that had an offer and was actually at Rice University, but came back to play in the AUS, the Atlantic University Sport Conference, and he goes in the first round, 6th overall to the Argos.
Another shocking pick. We had Mckellar ranked as our number 4 offensive lineman. So there are 2 linemen we liked better than him still on the board. But what you're betting on with Mckellar is that high-end upside, those high-end traits that saw him spend a year at Rice University in the United States before coming back to the Maritimes, where he grew up in Timberlake, Nova Scotia. I really like what he can potentially do. And we talked about physicality earlier. That's not an issue with Gregor Mckellar. He is mean. He is nasty. He will finish with intent. Now, part of the problem in assessing him at the AUS level is we know that's a smaller conference. It tends to be a weaker conference. And the competition he was going up against wasn't necessarily let's say pro caliber guys along the defensive line all the time. He faced some good players, don't get me wrong, but they tend to be smaller. And so I think he developed some bad habits in terms of just mauling guys, holding, almost tackling, torquing defenders to the ground for the finish, things that'll result in penalties at the next level. But you love his size. He actually checked in at 322 pounds at the CFL Combine and moved fairly well for that size. He's not the most nimble, but you can stick him at guard, and he's going to be a road grader for you if you can move or if you can polish off some of those rough edges that he developed from playing against guys that simply were not up to his level.
In my mind, if he hadn't gone to Rice University initially on a scholarship, he probably doesn't go in the first round because that pedigree helps boost him up. That's not a shot against the AUS. It's honestly just reality because, as you said, if you watch the tape from when he played for the X-Men, you probably wouldn't have thought this guy got any scholarship offers from south of the border, but he did, and he was down there. It's just sometimes, I mean, we all have the tendency to do it in different aspects of our life, but you see athletes or you see teams play down to the level of talent. That's not to say that Mckellar wasn't great there because he was an AUS All-Star. He was part of a team that won the Loney Bowl, the conference championship there in the AUS. But where you could tell that there was a definite difference in the talent level, at least overall in those teams, was when they went to the national semifinal, Western University on campus there. And to be quite honest, they got run over. It wasn't even a contest. But that tape would have been key in evaluating Mckellar, because you could have seen him go against a Deontay Knight, for example, in a legitimate front seven like the Mustangs had.
And he's got the anchor and the power and the strength to handle those type of guys. Now, he's not going to play a tackle at the next level. He's just not long enough, not quick enough with his feet, in my opinion, to do that. But he's going to be a very functional guard. And you're absolutely right, Dunk. That Rice scholarship, that initial year of university in the United States, plays a big role in this, because we don't see guys from the AUS go in the first round very often, but he has the pedigree, and teams love pedigree. And whether they admit to it or not, CFL teams tend to favor those guys who have played in the NCAA over guys who haven't, who have only played at U Sports. They give them the benefit of the doubt, even if you look at the measurables, and Mckellar is not necessarily that different from someone like a Noah Zaire or a Cyril Hogan-Sandon, who's far more athletic. He is larger than both of those guys, which I think plays into effect here. But you do worry about some of the stiffness and his ability to be mobile. But that pedigree from the States, the fact that there was a Division I program that said, wow, this guy has the traits. The CFL is a traits league, especially for Canadians that you're going to develop. You see those traits, you think he's still got them, and you can develop them with this first-round pick.
Indeed, really intriguing. The Argos are going to play the Touchdown Atlantic game this year, and you would imagine Mckellar hopes that he could be on the roster. JC, what do you think in terms of that potential? Can he be a dress roster player for the Argos, or might he be a guy that could go back to school or be on the practice roster?
There's a bit of a logjam on that Argos offensive line looking at it right now. I mean, you've got Peter Nicastro, who I thought was brilliant as a rookie, a first-round pick from last year. Shane Richards, who went first overall a couple years ago. That's someone they want to keep playing at guard. And then the other guy is probably Darius Bladdock at the other guard spot. But they also have guys in the pipeline like Taryn Churchill, who was also a first-round pick, and Dylan Giffen, who was a big body out of the University of Western. So there's a lot of guys that Mckellar is going to have to compete with. I think he's probably going to be practice roster or 6 offensive linemen early on. But the Argos, as we know, have spent big in some areas. They've spent a lot of money on that offensive line. I wonder if there's some more casualties coming before camp that may make it a clearer path to the field for someone like Mckellar.
We'll have to see, but the 7th overall pick is in. The green and white fans curious who it was going to be. The Saskatchewan Roughriders select receiver Samuel Emilus, 6'1", 200 pounds, out of Louisiana Tech University. Also spent some time previous to that at UMass. So 2 NCAA schools for Emilus, who goes 7th overall to the Riders.
We talked about a lot of the same things that we'll mention here with Emilus when it comes to Jalen Philpot. Not necessarily a burner down the field, but super quick, change of direction, good route runner, has that short area ability that you can be productive in the CFL. The difference between Emilus and the Philpot twins, and the reason why on our rankings we had Emilus actually ranked higher than both of the Philpots, is that the raw athleticism, the testing measurables are far superior for Emilus. He was a great tester. We're talking about a 37-inch vertical, a 10.4 broad jump. You know, he's a 4.59 40 guy, which isn't incredible, but his 10 split is a 1.47 and then a 6.88 3 cone. Like, those are some elite athletic numbers that he's putting up. And some are similar to the Philpots in terms of the 40, and even the 3 cones, not that different. But the vertical and the broad, that explosiveness metric is far superior to either Philpot twin. And you hope that translates to greater CFL success. Now, the Riders, we know, have some talented receivers, Justin McInnes, Keon Schaefer-Baker, who has emerged into one of the best Canadian players in the league, in my opinion, quite early in his career, Mitch Picton, but they drafted a guy last year, Terrell Jana, out of the University of Virginia, who they thought could be able to contribute in that rotation, who was a very good route runner. And then he up and retired on them. So Emlis, to me, sort of fills that replacement spot on their roster that Jana was supposed to hold, a guy who can develop and contribute, and who had to deal with some pretty terrible quarterbacking, in all honesty, during his time first at UMass and then Louisiana Tech, but battled through, was consistently productive, and was able to make some big plays for both of those programs.
The Riders also dealing with the loss of Braden Lenius, who was a high draft pick not too long ago for them after he signed with the Atlanta Falcons in the offseason. So a position that they're clearly invested at and wanted to make sure they could get an athletic dude with, as you mentioned it, the retirement of Jana combined with Lenius leaving for the NFL, because there's no certainty when Lenius might come back. He's got that big, long body, could be a target or matchup nightmare, problem at least in the NFL if he gets going there in Atlanta. It's a new regime, so he might get an opportunity there to perhaps make a mistake or two and still continue to at least have a shot to make that roster. So Emlis, really intriguing just from the standpoint that a lot of people felt like Noah Zare, the University of Saskatchewan offensive lineman, could be a prime fit for the Riders at 7, but they go receiver. I don't necessarily think a lot of people were thinking that, JC.
It's certainly not a position of immediate need. Now, we mentioned those 2 departures, but they still have plenty of talent at that position that I listed off earlier. So it's not a situation where Emlis is going to have to come in, get on the field, immediately start catching passes from Cody Fajardo in the starting lineup. They have guys that they like at those positions, and very talented guys. So you're right. It's a bit of a surprise that he goes, that they go receiver versus offensive line, which I feel like a lot of people thought was a major need for them last season. But we often forget how high they are internally on some of these players. Logan Furland was in his first year out of the CJFL last season as a starter. And they're really high on him. They want to see him develop. They're not looking to draft a replacement. You talk about Noah Zur, but they have a guy who didn't get to see the field last year because he had mono for most of the season, who they took in the first round, in Matlin Riley, who was also a key piece of that dominant Saskatchewan Huskies offensive line. So there is some people in the building that they like for those spots. And quite frankly, with the way their roster has been made up, I don't think it's impossible, if you really don't like what you see in training camp, you could start 2 Canadians on the offensive line if you want to go two receivers, and then Micah Tights, Mike Egum, and Charbel DeBeer at defensive tackle, if you really wanted to, if you were super uncomfortable with your offensive line situation. Now, I don't think that's what they're going to do, but it is an option. They are flexible enough there that they don't have to reach for an offensive lineman if they don't feel comfortable with him at that position.
And also, in general, teams are going to stick to their board and how they value and graded out the players. So perhaps the thought here is, without knowing exactly what the grades are, is that Emlis is a high caliber receiver that they feel like they can't get later in the draft, and vice versa. If they feel like there's an offensive lineman that wasn't necessarily warranting this high of a pick, but they feel like down in the next tier or the next time they pick, they can get somebody similar to a Noah Zare, or perhaps he's even available down there, then that's when they grab the offensive line, because most teams are going to come away with at least one, especially in the CFL draft. You got to make sure those boys up front are plentiful, right, JC?
Exactly. You could never have too many great Canadian offensive linemen. But the other factor playing into this draft, I wonder, is some of the changes we could see in the ratio coming forward. There are discussions behind the scenes, some we won't get into because this is a celebratory day for Canadian talent, but there are some discussions about changing the way the ratio is employed in terms of having a mandatory minimum of Canadians on defense. And if that's if that's put into effect in the near future, there are lots of teams that aren't set up for that situation. And Canadian offensive linemen lose a little bit of value if you're going to have to find athletes to play on defense. So I wonder if there's some strategizing going around with some of these teams that they might go with skilled defensive positions to try and flesh out their roster in that regard.
Chris Jones has just made his second pick of the first round, and it will be the one that draws a lot of focus from across the country, North America, and Randy Ambrosi hopes around the world. Trey Ford, quarterback, University of Waterloo, goes 8th overall to the Edmonton Elks. Jones gets his guy. This was talked about behind the scenes that Jones had quietly developed a liking for specifically Trey Ford. He actually loves both brothers, so we'll see if he gets a shot at Tyrell Ford, the defensive back. But right now, it's about the quarterback and arguably generational talent at the quarterback position.
We have not seen a Canadian quarterback like Trey Ford, I would say, ever in the history of the game. He is that unique in terms of the skill set of what he brings to the table. Now, from a pure passing standpoint, is he the best quarterback in that regard? Probably not. He's functional enough in that regard. I think he's got a good arm, maybe not an elite arm, but a very, very good arm. He throws a pretty ball. He can do enough for you in terms of running the offense and making plays from the pocket. But it's his ability to create when he gets on the run that is so special. We're talking, guys like Michael Vick, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson. Those are the comps in terms of the play style to what Trey Ford did at the University of Waterloo. That's how unique a player he is at the quarterback position, where he can run around back there to buy time and make a play, or take off with his 4.45 speed and just burn a defense. Chris Jones is a mad scientist. Stephen McAdoo will love this guy in terms of having specific packages for him. And we've discussed Trey Ford is a guy that some teams don't think can only play quarterback. I think Chris Jones will have him play quarterback and have him do a bunch of other things as well. Take advantage of the new CFL rule that allows 2 quarterbacks on the field at a time and do some unique things for this Edmonton Elks team.
And some people out there might laugh when you use the comparisons of Russell Wilson or Lamar Jackson for Trey Ford, but it's legit. He's either faster than Wilson or almost as fast as Jackson, who ran in the 4.3s when he was coming out. But the difference is those guys did it at the NCAA Power 5 conference level. And in my mind, that's the sticking point as to why Trey Ford has not yet signed an NFL contract. And I say yet because he's been invited to 2 NFL rookie minicamps, Baltimore and the New York Giants. So he has an opportunity at least to get in front of those staff, scouts, and coaches alike and potentially get that NFL contract. But if you put Ford at an NCAA school and he came out with these athletic numbers that you mentioned earlier, 4.45 in the 40, 36-inch vertical leap, he was the most athletic quarterback in the NFL draft class, let alone the CFL class. So people shouldn't be laughing when we're talking about Ford at least having a play style like Lamar Jackson, like Russell Wilson, because it wasn't too long ago. You go back 10, 15, 20 years, those guys would have been the CFL, but there's been a big shift in the NFL to allowing those dual threat quarterbacks to actually get on the field and go higher and higher in the draft. So Ford is that type of talent. The tricky part for scouts, though, especially the NFL ones who don't necessarily entirely comprehend the U Sports level of play and have a comparison for any of the levels down in the NCAA, is the tape, because they're watching him play some of these schools and they just don't understand the caliber of talent. I'm sure we'll talk about Ford a ton, but the last pick of the first round has just come in. The Alouettes, with their second pick, they kicked this thing off by taking Tyrell Richards, the linebacker from Syracuse University, number 1 overall, going 9 overall. Danny Machocha, the GM, selects Tyson Philpot, receiver, University of Calgary. So both Philpots go in the first round, but not necessarily to the destinations we would have thought. In Machocha, 2 picks that have nothing to do with Quebec.
He's shocking us all. Like, I wonder if this is a trend that will continue throughout this draft, because his previous 2 drafts were so unique in terms of the COVID situation. He leaned very heavily on his prior experience as the head coach of the Montreal Carabins and recruiting all those Quebecois talents. I wonder if it's less so in this draft when he's got more data. He's been able to see all those guys play this last year. They addressed a need on defense with their first pick. Here, I think they address a need on offense. They may start 2 Canadian receivers this year. They've got Keon Julian Grant, who's a fantastic young player, and Hergy Mayala, who we've seen his potential coming over from the Calgary Stampeders. But beyond that, it's a little bit thin. They have Rashawn Simonize, who is a highly regarded prospect in his own right coming out, but has struggled to stick in the CFL at the CFL level. Has some issues in terms of can he pick up a playbook and do things like that. And then beyond him, they have 2 undrafted free agents that they've signed. Mathieu Robitaille out of the Université de Laval and Ante Aguavin from Wilfrid Laurier. These are guys who were not picked in their respective CFL drafts. Talented players in their own right, but not premier prospects. And if you've got Hergy Mayala injured or Keon Julian Grant goes down, Tyson Philpot is a guy who can step right in and do much of the same things that we talked about with his brother. And what I like about his game is he's maybe not as explosive. He's a little bit faster in his 40, but he's a more experienced receiver. He came to it earlier in his career where he was the U Sports Rookie of the Year, the Peter Gorman Trophy winner as a true freshman, as a receiver, while Jalen Philpot played a little bit of running back that year. Tyson was a receiver his whole career, and so he understands where to settle in the zone defense a little bit better, how to get open, how to exploit a coverage. I think he's more refined in that regard, and the Alouettes are going to be able to have a guy on their roster who can take starting reps if they need him to.
Yeah, Jalen Philpot might have been listed at running back at first year, but he was playing at receiver, just wasn't to the level of Tyson. Tyson certainly from day one was a more productive Philpot, but both players can be productive, and these teams are hoping that they can be productive at the pro level. If you're just joining us, we'll run it down. The first down shook down like this. The Montreal Alouettes take Tyrell Richards, linebacker, Syracuse University, first overall. The Red Blacks followed up with Zach Pellihos, University of Ottawa, offensive lineman at number 2. At 3, the BC Lions, Nathan Cherry, defensive lineman out of the University of Saskatchewan. 4th overall, Edmonton, Chris Jones, first pick of 2 in the first round. Enoch Makonzo, defensive back, Coastal Carolina. 5th overall, the Stampeders go with a familiar face, University of Calgary receiver Jalen Philpot. 6th overall, the Argos select offensive lineman Gregor Mckellar out of St. Francis Xavier University. 7th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders choose Samuel Emelis out of Louisiana Tech, also spent some time at UMass, a receiver. 8th overall, arguably the headliner of the draft, and yes, I might be biased as a former Canadian quarterback, but it's just the facts. Edmonton selects Trey Ford, quarterback, University of Waterloo, the reigning Heck Crichton Trophy winner, as the best player in Canadian university football. And then to round it out, the Alouettes, 9th overall, select Tyson Philpot, University of Calgary receiver. And as we get into the second round here, the Argos on the clock at 10th overall. JC, I'm going to ask you quick here. What was your one favorite pick of the first round?
Oh, that's a tough question, but I'll say Zach Pellihos at number 2. To me, I have to go with the Hoggies, Dunk. I just have to. It's a requirement for me, and I fell in love with this guy's ability to move, seeing him at the combine. He battled his way up from the regional. He was not highly regarded coming into this year, but had a fantastic season, moves like butter, and I think he may end up being the top player from this draft class when we look back on it, 5, 6, 7 years down the line.
Wow, that's saying a lot considering the talent that went off the board in the first round. People think the Philpots can step in right away and be productive. We talked about a generational quarterback going off the board in Trey Ford, and J.C. is going with the big man Pellihos to be the best player out of this first round. We got to cut this tape out and save it for later, buddy.
Absolutely. I will stand by that. And if he fails, he fails. But I believe in Zach Pellihos' ability. You just don't find offensive linemen that move like he does, that bend like he does at his size.
All right. In the second round, the Argos are currently on the clock at 10th overall. Then it'll go Red Blacks, BC, Winnipeg, Calgary, Toronto again. So they have 2 picks in the second round. Saskatchewan, Hamilton, Montreal, and then there are the 2 territorial picks at 19 and 20, Edmonton and Ottawa, respectively. So, JC, we've had 9 picks come off the board. Who is someone that is still out there that's surprising that we could see go in the second round?
There's 2 names that really come to mind. First of all, Tyrell Ford, the twin brother of Trey Ford. He's just as athletic as his brother, but as a defensive back, I think he's fallen a little bit because the tape maybe not as technically sound as it could be for an athlete of his caliber, but a traits-based projection that you absolutely love. And then Deontay Knight. We're talking about the kid who got invited to the East-West Shrine game, a very coveted position, has NFL interest. He's going to be in 2 NFL mini camps. He's that caliber of player, and he's fallen out of the first round entirely. That is a shocking one for me.
It really is. There's some scouts that feel like they wanted to see him test better, and that's probably part of the reason he's fallen out of the first round. But then you look at the NFL interest and couple that with the fact that he went to the East-West Shrine Bowl and did really well on the field there, that it is surprising that he doesn't go off the board. There are some people that will tell you, though, that if it had been somebody different, like let's say a Trey Ford that went to the East-West Shrine Bowl, that maybe Ford right now has an NFL contract in hand because he would have had that time learning an NFL type offense, actually would have had film playing the 4-down game against a lot of talent that would have been drafted in the 2022 NFL draft. So that is certainly an intriguing point for me, that something as simple as a selection, and it came down to Deontay Knight and Trey Ford to get that coveted spot at the East-West Shrine Bowl, could change the future of both players. But in this case, Knight has fallen down the board and Ford has actually gone ahead of him. And it's just so intriguing me to think these small things you might not necessarily know or pay attention to all the time can affect not only the CFL draft, but the career trajectory of these players. Because I thought about it afterwards and I thought, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that if Ford would have played in the East-West Shrine Bowl against NFL caliber talent, done well and picked up the offense and shown he can go through progressions, that he probably has an NFL contract right now.
Could be the case. I mean, it was an interesting East-West Shrine Bowl this season because typically they take 2 Canadians, but they shrunk it down to just 1 this year. And Knight was the only one who got that spot. Now, I will push back, Dunk, on the Canadian quarterback conversation just a little bit, because I know just like I'm biased on offensive linemen, you can be a little bit biased when it comes to the quarterbacks. I did get to see Trey Ford against American competition when he went down and played at the College Gridiron Showcase in Fort Worth, Texas. Not the same level of game as the East-West Shrine Bowl, but there were players drafted out of that event, multiple guys who signed NFL contracts. And what you saw from Ford that week is the arm talent is there. He throws a pretty ball. He does all the things. But when it came time for an American defense to be put in front of him or for the live scrimmage, he really, really struggled with that adjustment. So I don't know if going to a more high-profile game and struggling in the game situation in terms of his ability to be a passer would have helped his stock as much as you might expect. But what he certainly could have showed, and what he showed down in Texas in the live scrimmage when he was finally allowed to run, is that he's faster than anybody on the field, because he took off and it was 40 yards down the field before anyone was even close to him. People were hollering from the sidelines, "Hey, Kyler Murray, slow up." People were actually saying that about Trey Ford. I'm not the only one making that comp. American NCAA players who would know that stuff were saying it. So I don't know if as a passer he would have shone in that environment. And I don't think we should expect him to, because that is a big jump to go from reading a Canadian defense all the time to reading American defense for the first time against very tough competition and expecting that quarterback to have a tremendous performance. That doesn't happen very often. So I'm not sure how it would have really affected his stock had he been selected for that game.
For me, the structure is the key difference there. And the College Gridiron Showcase is not quite the same because they don't play a live full game. So I think if you would have went to the East-West Shrine Bowl, had that structure, the practice time, maybe more meeting time, learning the playbook, instead of just a scrimmage, is totally different. You know this, JC, when you strap the pads on and it's game time, a different light goes on. So I think that could have made a major difference, especially for Ford, who has made a lot of plays throughout his career, especially at the University of Waterloo, off schedule, so to speak, when he's scrambling out of the pocket. And that tantalizing ability, if it was shown in the 4-down game against a lot of NFL draft picks, I think could have really helped his chances to get an NFL contract. There's still a chance that he gets one because he has those 2 NFL rookie minicamps, but clearly Chris Jones and the Edmonton Elks are rolling the dice and hoping that he doesn't. And to be quite honest, I know we're talking a lot about Ford right now, but that quarterback situation in Edmonton, you could argue, is wide open. We know for a fact they've been trying to trade Nick Arbuckle for the better part of the offseason. It doesn't seem like that offensive staff or Jones really like Arbuckle all that much. Taylor Cornelius is there, started some games, of course, last year in that dismal season for the green and gold. JT Barrett has been signed, and that's been a guy that Jones has hyped up. So you add Ford potentially, if he doesn't get an NFL contract, to that wide open quarterback situation.
You look at what Jones and the rest of his staff had said about JT Barrett through this process. They love the athleticism. They love the leadership. They love that he's a winner. Well, Trey Ford, to me, fits that bill. Like he's that player at the U Sports level. Now, that has an effect, certainly, but they want a quarterback like that to lead their team. They don't want a pocket passer that's just going to sit back there and dish out the ball in a regimented system. They want a playmaker at that position, and they want multiple playmakers, guys that they can bring in for different packages. I can't think of a spot that would be better for Trey Ford to get on the field early than in Edmonton, where it really is wide open and they covet his skill set.
And if Jones has invested a high pick, and in this case, a first rounder in a player, he's going to give him more runway. Now, we should say that Ford necessarily didn't have as good of a winning record as Barrett did at Ohio State University, and it's clearly a much different level. And Barrett was part of a team that won a national championship with the Buckeyes. Ford never got Waterloo even close to a Yates Cup championship, the Ontario University Athletics title, but he did turn that program around from a team that was getting trounced, and after the steroid scandal there, was getting beat up good, back into a program that was making the playoffs and at least competing with the upper echelon of the OUA that is ultra competitive. And he was giving, didn't matter who it was, any defense's fits that he faced during his time at the University of Waterloo.
The proof will be in the pudding next season when we see what the Waterloo Warriors look like in the OUA without Trey Ford. And I don't suspect that it will reflect well on them, unfortunately. Now, I think with a new quarterback getting some developed, they can get back there. I love some of the things they've done to revitalize that program, but Trey Ford was a huge part of it. He was the Heck Creighton Trophy winner for a reason. He was dynamic. He did it all for that team, and he made the people around him better because of it. So I wonder, you mentioned he didn't win, and that's true. He didn't take them to a Yates. But from where that program started to where its peak was when Trey Trey Ford was on the field was night and day.
Yeah, I've been there, man. It's a difficult thing to do. I can remember being recruited to the University of Guelph, sitting in the stands at old Ron Joy Stadium at McMaster. They were wood stands, and watching Guelph get just crushed in an OUA quarterfinal game against a McMaster team that at the time was led by head coach Greg Marshall, who's now at Western, and a juggernaut school, and just thought, I kind of would rather go, and it was my hometown school, to a team and turn a program around, but it's difficult. So to be the first, and not only to be the first to get it rolling, but to win a Heck Crichton trophy, that's going to have a lasting effect on the program, because now quarterbacks and other players are going to look at Chris Bertoya, the head coach there at Waterloo, and say, yeah, I can come here and I can help this program advance, and I can have a shot at some of those national awards, and most importantly, a Yates Cup or a Vanier Cup. They didn't get to one with Ford there, but you have to have that building block, and Ford and his brother, honestly, Tyrell Ford, and even Tyler Chernowski would be in this group as well. Jesse Gibbon, who's with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, a high draft pick just not too long ago, are part of that turnaround with Trey Ford. So it's not just him, but he's certainly the headliner. You win that Heck Crichton trophy, and then you get a bunch of recruits wanting to come to your program because they've at least proven now with Ford that they can have some success or at least be competitive.
Yeah, he's a guy that people want to play with, right? When you're recruiting guys and you sell them, hey, you can be on the offense with Trey Ford, right? How he can create, he's going to open up opportunities for you. That's a major selling feature for recruits.
JC, we have our first pick of the second round on the board at 10th overall. The Toronto Argonauts select defensive lineman Deontay Knight from Western University. One of the guys that you picked out as being a surprise that fell out of the first round, doesn't fall too far, goes 10th overall.
I don't think the Argos would have suspected that Deontay Knight would be there. Nobody who did a mock draft thought Deontay Knight would be there for the Argos at the top of the second round. But here he is, and this is a run-in-the-card situation. You take the best player available, which is Deontay Knight from the University of Western, and he fits a need that you have on your team in terms of upgrading your rotational Canadian interior defensive line. Right now they have Fabian Foote. It's a little bit older now. Sam Atchibong from a couple years ago in the draft. They were okay last year. Deontay Knight can be a huge upgrade at that position and somebody who can give you a little bit of change of pace on the edge because he's proved he can play defensive end at 278 as well. Now, the athletic measurables are part of the reason why he falls to the second round. He didn't show well in the testing. And even in something like the bench press, he was surprisingly low. In fact, almost everyone from the University of Western this year, I don't know what's going on with the weight program there, was surprisingly low in the bench press. But you don't see a lack of strength on tape from him. He's a bull. He has a pretty quick get off for his size, and he gets inside of guys and rushes with just pure effort and power once he gets on their edge. He's not particularly sophisticated with his hands. And one of the reasons why I don't think he ultimately got as much NFL interest as people suspected early in the prospect process is he's got really short arms. He's got almost 30-inch arms, which for most NFL teams is a disqualifying trait. They want those guys on the defensive line to have 32, 33, 34-inch arms, and he is below that measurable cutoff point for a lot of teams. But I think at the CFL level, if you learn or if you teach him to use his hands a little bit better, and he has that power from his lower body there, he can drive guys back. He's going to be someone who can contribute on the inside of your defensive line.
And perhaps part of the reason he fell, and we should mention this, is that he has 2 NFL rookie minicamp invites, one with Washington and Tampa Bay. And there was a thought at a few points that he might have signed an undrafted free agent contract. So if he was close to that, I know Washington has been highly interested in him, then perhaps some of the intel from CFL teams was that, hey, if he signs a contract, we might not see this guy this year. So that could be part of the reason. And in terms of the athletic measurables, I feel like in its player or case dependent, but sometimes those get taken the wrong way or we put too much emphasis on them. And the one guy I'll point out for that, when he's still in the league, is Kwaku Boateng. Fell to the 5th round, didn't test, wasn't as explosive as people felt like he would be coming out of Wilfrid Laurier University. But the guy is arguably the best Canadian pass rusher in the league, and it's been so for a couple of years. So in my mind, Knight is a better football player than he is a tester. And ultimately, that's what he's going into the pros to be, is a football player. So if he doesn't sign an NFL contract, and maybe even regardless of that, the Argos potentially got a value pick here with him going 10th overall.
Yeah, the concerns with his measurables, with his explosiveness, I look at some of the things he did at the East-West Shrine Bowl, as we've mentioned previous. The power was not an issue there. The get-off was not an issue there. He got inside guys. He jacked them up. He drove them back pretty consistently in those practice sessions. And then in the game, he had some flashes. Now, there were some concerns about his stamina coming out of that game. I think he sort of tapered off towards the end after some early flashes. But this is a steal for the Argos in my mind at 10, a player I didn't think would be available to them and will fit very nicely onto their defensive line rotation.
He certainly could, and it kind of fits with their philosophy, so to speak, of trying to get players that are closer to home. And with him having just played down the road at Western University, makes a lot of sense. He has that CFL pedigree as well. His dad, Dwayne Knight, played in the CFL, was a linebacker. One of the teams he played for were the Ottawa Rough Riders. So a guy that's got that pedigree as well, and also has some of that. It's not necessarily NCAA pedigree, but American pedigree, because initially when he was coming out of high school, went to Arizona Western Junior College, which is a big time program that one Jonathan Kongbo went to, a Canadian defensive lineman that ended up playing at the University of Tennessee after he went to Arizona Western. So Knight was there, but in reality, it just seemed like he got homesick, came back to Western. They treated him well, and got the most out of Mr. Knight.
And I don't think you can question his work ethic either, because he wasn't necessarily a dominant force pre-pandemic coming into that process. He's a guy who deferred his CFL draft year because he didn't have the production numbers, right? He was supposed to be taken in 2021, but deferred because of the pandemic. But he came out of that gap year, as it were, stronger than ever. He really worked on his quickness. He looked a lot more polished. He was able to rush from multiple positions and had the level of production that rightfully earned him the JP Metris trophy as the top lineman in all of Canadian university football. And I don't think there was really anyone else in contention for that award because of what he was able to do for the Western Mustangs.
Indeed, he was a beast on the defensive line, and that Western team that won the Vanier Cup last year was ultra physical, and Knight was one of the leaders in that department. And it should be noted that they ended up beating a University of Saskatchewan team that had multiple pro prospects on that offensive line. So Knight had a solid day that day, took a lot of the focus, and allowed some of the other players to get off free and make some plays. But Knight was certainly the focal piece for me on that defense, along with Daniel Valente, who was all over the field, a veteran player in a secondary for the Mustangs, who we might see get picked in this draft. But it was really Knight, especially up front, that was the focal point. And we have the next pick off the board. In the second round, 11th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks select Cyril Hogan-Saint-Don from Laval University, an offensive lineman, J.C. I know you love your O-lineman, but specifically, you really love Pellihos and this dude.
Yeah, the Red Blacks, I'm going to have a conversation with, because they've taken, with their top two selections, my top two ranked offensive linemen. I had Zach Pellihos 1 and Cyril Hogan-Saint-Don as my second ranked lineman. So he is a player that I really love, a natural center with size who has all the lateral quickness that you want for that position, to be able to get to the front side on zone blocks, to be able to pick up stunts and that sort of thing. And he's just a powerful puncher. He just knocks you back when he hits you with first contact, which I absolutely love. Strong and quick. That's a lethal combination. And I think he's a little bit more pro-ready than people give him credit for. There was some thought that both he and Pellihos are guys that might benefit from going back to school or from a lot more development. I think Hogan Sandow, he's got some rough edges, but he could contribute a little bit earlier than some people give him credit for. Now, what I question about this pick is we talked about Ottawa with that offensive line, with that first pick, that they didn't really have a need there, and they had the benefit of time to develop him. Now you're adding Hogan Sandow. That's a bit of a logjam in your offensive line room. I count 9, 10, 11, 12 Canadian offensive linemen on their training camp roster as of right now. So something will have to give there with some other prospects to make room for these very talented individuals that they're bringing onto the team.
Well, you want to make sure you have depth at the offensive line position, specifically in the way that CFL rosters are constructed. No matter what happens with the ratio in the CBA, I think the linemen are still going to be playing there a lot in terms of the Canadian guys. And oftentimes what happens in the draft is we see picks that might not necessarily surprise us, but in this case with Ottawa, they go 2 O-linemen, but perhaps they know that one of their offensive linemen got hurt in the offseason or isn't showing up or has decided to retire. And oftentimes that doesn't come out until after the draft, because if it comes out before, then the other teams are going to have an idea of what they might be looking to grab when the actual draft takes place. But J.C., I mean, I'm not an offensive line guy, but for the Red Blacks to get these 2 dudes and to tag that along with what they did in remaking the offensive line in free agency, it's showing that Burke is making that a focal point, that we have to be better up front. The one key area for them, though, is going to be the tackle spot, because it looks like they have great depth now in the middle.
Burke is the element to these 2 picks that I think we're not spending enough time talking about. Coming into Ottawa as the new GM, they had tremendous success in Hamilton drafting offensive linemen, developing offensive linemen. You look at guys like Brandon Revenberg, Darius Sirocco, who he's now brought over, having Chris Van Zyl, developing sometimes fringe guys like Kay Okafor, who were defensive linemen, and really putting in the time and effort to getting them polished to the point where they can contribute to your football team. That was always a focus in Hamilton. Now Burke comes over to Ottawa, and this is maybe a culture-changing draft for that offensive line, right? He looks at the guys who are existing on that roster that maybe other people brought in. He gets some early veterans that can help right away, but he looks at those developmental prospects and says, I didn't really like that guy when I was in Hamilton. I don't see him as highly as maybe Marcel Desjardins did. So now I'm going to bring in my own guys who fit the way I want to build a football team. And these are 2 fantastic selections in terms of offensive linemen. Our 1 and 2 guys on the board, I think they have the higher ceiling than guys that we've talked a lot about in the past, like Noah Zer and Gregor Mckellar, who was taken above Cyril Hogan-Sandow. I would much rather have Cyril Hogan-Sandow as my center than Gregor Mckellar as my guard.
Intriguing. Got the offensive line expert here to talk about it, at least from a scouting perspective, as we await the BC Lions, currently on the clocks in the second round, 12th overall, my man. There has been not as many O-linemen, I feel like, as usual go off the board, though. What does that say about Canadian talent, especially in the first round?
We haven't really touched on it, but this is regarded across the league as a weaker draft. And I think that is a fair assessment in some regards. And there are reasons for that, dating back to the COVID-19 pandemic, both on the U Sports side and on the NCAA side. A lot of top talent that would have been in this draft class deferred so they could go back to school next year. And so there's guys that we would be talking about in this first round conversation that we'll be talking about next year instead. This is a weaker draft overall than we're used to seeing. And in particular, it's weak at certain high value positions, as it were. It's particularly weak along the offensive line. There's not a tremendous amount of high quality depth like there might normally be. And so that's why we're seeing, just a handful taken early when normally it's offensive lineman central.
Well, you just said it, JC. We've got back-to-back O-linemen that come off the board with the 12th overall pick in the 2022 CFL Draft. The BC Lions select Noah Zaire, offensive lineman, University of Saskatchewan.
Back-to-back Huskies for the Lions. They really value that, and I think this is actually a really good fit for Noah Zaire. I wondered if at number 3 overall, he would be someone that they would consider. Now, we have him ranked behind Pellihos and Hogan Sandon on our list of offensive linemen. But I agree with sort of the universal assessment that Noah Zaire is the most pro-ready of the bunch. He may not have the highest ceiling, but he for sure has the highest floor. The left tackle for the Huskies, he was an absolute mauler in the run game. He's really long, really physical. He showed well at the combine in those one-on-ones. Has some limitations in terms of stiffness, in terms of his movement ability that I think drops him down the board. But what I see in a guy like Zaire is the potential for him, if he works hard at it, if he's in the right situation, to have a career similar to someone like a Patrick Neufeld, who maybe isn't the world's greatest athlete. He's not a measurable king, but has had a very consistent career on the interior of an offensive line. Another University of Saskatchewan Husky who does the dirty work, who's physical in the run game, and found a situation in Winnipeg where he could become the best version of himself. BC wants to run sort of inside zone, north-south stuff. Kelly Bates, another University of Saskatchewan Husky, is their offensive line coach. I think Noah Zaire fits what they want to do if they put him at guard. He can get physical. He can get that movement at the first level, knock guys off the ball, and be very successful for the BC Lions.
And it's not really a secret to anybody in the league or the fans checking this out that the Lions need help on the offensive line, be it Mike Riley, who retired early in some people's estimation, or Nathan Rourke slinging the ball at quarterback. Rourke appears to be the guy that's going to be the starter unless something crazy happens, I would say, and he gets beat out for that spot. It's going to be Rourke slinging the ball. They had to protect him better, and there were some people, even after free agency was over and they spent a bunch of money elsewhere, that felt like, well, they didn't do enough to upgrade the offensive line. And you talked about Zaire being a pro-ready prospect. It's probably not fair to him to think that he could step in and start right away, but he might have that ability, and especially if he goes to camp and earns it, that's well within the realm of possibility. But BC certainly needs even more help after this pick.
They really do. Now, the saving grace for the Lions in terms of their weakness along the offensive line, in terms of Canadian talent, is that they are going to start 3 Americans along their offensive line. Only 2 of these spots will be Canadian. Now, Suk Chung has one of those spots absolutely locked up at right guard. The question will be whether Peter Godber, who was a first-round pick a number of years ago and has not really lived up to expectations, will keep his spot at center, or whether Philip Norman will take that spot as an American at center and they find somebody else to play guard. Noah Zaire, I think, has the potential to be that guy at guard if he shows well in training camp, if he brings that physicality. And I would also like to say that Noah Zaire, speaking to him, is one of my favorite prospects in this draft. He's incredibly down to earth, grounded, intelligent. I think he's going to be a great locker room guy for you. And if I could transform myself physically into any one individual in the planet, it would be Noah Zur. Massive man, but incredibly lean. And those baby blues, Justin Dunk, they got me right here.
And Zara came from a small town in Saskatchewan, right? Playing less than 12-man ball.
Yes, he did. He came from a small town. And I think when he was 14, he moved, got a billet and moved into the big city so he could play for a better high school and develop as a football player. That shows you his commitment right from the start in order to become the best that he can be.
I believe it was Yorkton where he grew up, if I got it right. And he was probably playing 9-man ball out there. Found a way to get out on the field. The next pick is in the second round. 13th overall, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers have selected Tyrell Ford, defensive back, University of Waterloo. So 2 sets of twins are now off the board. The Fords and the Philpots, who went in the first round.
A fantastic selection here from Winnipeg, and I think one that really addresses a need for them. Brandon Alexander is going to be hurt entering the season, so they don't have their all-star American safety. And so there's discussion that could be a Canadian spot for them. Right now, the candidates for that are 2 brothers. And we talk about twins. These ones are brothers, Noah and Nick Hallett. But I think Tyrell Ford could be in the mix to start at safety early in his career based on his athletic ability, his speed, 4.42 in the 40. Absolutely explosive. He'll go sideline to sideline if you want to move him back to safety. And quite frankly, I don't think he's reached his developmental potential as a cornerback either. The tape, part of the reason why he falls down here despite his athleticism is he's not particularly technical when you watch the film. It's a little bit sloppy at times. He relies on the fact that he's simply a superior athlete. If you've got a good coaching staff who thinks that they can develop him, I think this is a guy who could be your field side corner somewhere down the line, but certainly someone who will contribute as a safety very early on.
You know, if the Bombers are picking him too, that Mike O'Shea probably likes his character and feels like he's going to fit into that locker room, because that's something that Winnipeg puts a high value on. Anybody that's signed or selected in any draft in Winnipeg has to be able to fit that locker room culture that O'Shea holds near and dear to his heart. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Fords were so highly regarded. They're not arrogant. They're not very talkative, and I mean that in a good way. They let their play do the speaking by and large. So I think Ford, from that perspective, will fit in well with Winnipeg.
2 incredibly mature individuals from speaking to them. I think they're grounded. They've got their head in the right place. And they're not overly reliant on each other. I don't think either of the sets of twins that have been drafted so far are, tied at the hip like we tend to think of identical twins in sports. Both guys said that they want to play in different places, and Tyrell and Trey Ford have mentioned the fact that, look, like we are our own individuals. We've lived in different cities now through the pandemic. We have our own lives, our own relationships. We're excited to go through this journey together, but we're also excited to see each other and play against each other on the field. And that'll be a hell of a day if Trey Ford gets under center for the Edmonton Elks and Tyrell Ford is back there for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Somebody is going to exploit the other person. And Tyrell Ford, in this draft process, during one of his media availabilities, said, I am going to be the one who picks him off before he throws a touchdown on me, because he's never done that in practice.
Hopefully we get to see that day, because that means that Trey Ford is slinging the rock in the CFL, although honestly, it'd be cool to see if he could do it in the NFL. And then that also means that Tyrell Ford would be on the field for the Bombers or potentially elsewhere. But we should note Tyrell Ford does have not 1, but 2 NFL rookie minicamp invites, just like his brother. The New York Jets is one of them, and the other one, for whatever reason, is escaping me right now, but he's got 2 that he'll go get a look from.
And that's his athleticism showing again. Another guy who was at the College Gridiron Showcase and showed, I think, he improved as the week went on. Early on, he was a little bit shaky, adjusting to the new situation, but really took off in the last couple practices and in the scrimmage. Showed how intelligent he was to be able to pick up the new role very early on in his career. I think he'll do the same thing at the CFL level. I hope he gets an NFL contract. I want to preface any conversation we say about these mini camp invites by saying, I hope they sign in the NFL, they earn millions of dollars, they become stars. It's just statistically unlikely. You mentioned Darryl Wog as being the exception, but we typically get 5 or 6 guys every year who have a mini camp invite or two, and very rarely do they turn into contracts. Very rarely do they turn into contracts for American guys, but they show you that they're getting that look, which is a testament to their athleticism and their ability on the football field.
And the other NFL rookie minicamp invite for Tyrell Ford is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So he's got 2, the Steelers and Jets. And as you alluded to, an opportunity at least to get in front of those coaching staffs, those front offices, those scouts to potentially earn an NFL contract. So a little bit of a gamble, even though the numbers are against him, for the Bombers to take him 13th overall. The next pick in the second round is in 14th overall, Josiah Shackle from the University of Alberta, linebacker, and has also played defensive back for the Golden Bears.
Extremely versatile. And we have a unique situation here, I think, Dunk, in that so far in the first 2 rounds of this draft, we've seen the Heck Creighton Trophy winner, Trey Ford, get selected. We've seen the JP Metris Trophy winner as the top lineman, Deontay Knight, get selected. And now we have our President's Trophy winner as the top U Sports defensive player, Josiah Shackle, get selected. And that's a trophy that he very much merited. He is a dynamic defender. He comes downhill with speed. He finishes tackles with intent. I think he's a very quick processor with the game in front of him. You see him as a linebacker, but he played halfback very successfully for the University of Alberta as well. So he's got coverage upside, blitzing upside, and he's going to be a demon on special teams. If you're a team like Calgary that's going to start a Canadian linebacker after acquiring Cameron Judge, now you've got some depth there already with guys like Fraser Sopik. The rich just get richer when you have Josiah Shackle on your team now. He's going to be able to contribute in a number of different ways, and I really like this pick.
Shackle is an absolute baller. He does it in a quiet way. Ultra physical. You mentioned it, has played in multiple positions, looked really comfortable. Honestly, no matter where he lined up, I'm sure that's something that Stamps defensive coordinator Brett Monson will like about Shackle. And JC, I'm curious if you know this little tidbit that Shackle actually played ball with one Chuba Hubbard. So maybe that's part of the reason why he's such a sure tackler. He's used to going against Hubbard in practice.
That would be a hell of a matchup in high school to have to go up against Chuba Hubbard. I actually, I was born in that area. I would have gone to that high school had I not moved to BC. And I tell you what, I was able to play a lot on my high school football team out here. I would not have played on that high school football team. I would not have been that caliber of athlete.
And for the uninitiated, that was Bev Facey in what's the small little...
Sherwood Park, Alberta.
That's it, just outside Edmonton, Sherwood Park, Bev Facey, where Chuba Hubbard went to high school and then went on to start Oklahoma State. And, of course, now is with the Carolina Panthers. Started games for them last year, and Shackle has that connection with him because they're from that same high school and played together. They still talk and text and keep in touch. And I think it's one of the reasons why Shackle is so good, because he saw that dude on a regular basis in practice. And this guy is going to be a great pro. Like, I don't see this guy busting out. That bust factor is ultra low with Shackle. Chris Morris, the head coach there at the University of Alberta, would rave about him. And his defensive coordinator last year was Tom Higgins, who, of course, is a Grey Cup winning head coach and general manager in his own right. And he raved about Shackle as well. That guy knew the defense so well, always helping out his teammates, or at least was always there if they had any questions about what was going on or made checks over there. constantly on a University of Alberta team that Shackle's been instrumental in turning around, made the playoffs. They hosted a Canada West playoff game. Could have hosted one. But they actually went to the University of Manitoba and played in there. So that was a big step for the program to get into the playoffs and at least be competitive. With that, the next pick in the second round is off the board. 15th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Daniel Adeboboye, running back, Bryant University.
The Argos are thanking their lucky stars that Adeboboye did not go between their last selection and this one, because it's a desperate need for the team, and there is only one player in the entire draft who can really fill it. Now that they've signed Andrew Harris, they're going to probably start or at least play significantly with a Canadian at the running back position. Obviously, DJ Foster will be in and out at that spot as well for some different looks. But if you're starting a Canadian, you need a backup. And this is a weak running back draft, but Daniel Adeboboye is good by any metric. Tests incredibly athletic across the board and is very strong. He won the bench press among Canadian players at 28 reps as a running back. You don't see that every day. Normally, that's a realm for the offensive lineman and defensive lineman. He's very stout. He's very explosive. He played down at Bryant, which is an FCS school. That's the football championship subdivision for the uninitiated. It's Division I AA, as it were, is what it used to be called. But still very tough, high quality competition. And he was successful for a number of years, usually in a tandem backfield situation. But he has a play style that I think fits the Canadian game and is not dissimilar from what Andrew Harris does, in the fact that he's sort of a one-cut slasher. Like, he's not going to hit you for a home run. He's not going to go 60 yards downfield and break away from everybody, but he's going to pick up chunk yardage consistently with a good offensive line in front of him, be no nonsense and reliable in the backfield. And he has the physicality and the skill set to be able to contribute on special teams with some of that dirty work as well, which you can't always say about every starting caliber running back.
That can add to his value, and the Argos needed a backup Canadian running back, especially with Harris coming off that season, where he was limited by injury that he suffered in training camp. Came back in the playoffs and looked great, but there's some questions around the league of, can he get through an entire season? I mean, he's played with a chip on his shoulder, Harris, that is, his entire career, and has proven a lot of people wrong. So it's a possibility he could get through another year, even at his advanced age for a running back. But to have Adeboboye come in and be a guy that, to be quite honest, is probably about as close to pro ready as you're going to get in a CFL draft, like a guy that's actually going to come to camp for you, is a great value for the Argos.
It certainly is. And another guy that you talk about being extremely grounded and selfless. If you tweet about Daniel Adeboboye during this draft, chances are his dad is going to retweet you. He's a pastor in the Toronto area, so comes from a good, strong family. That's something that teams look for. And he's not afraid to be that second guy. Sometimes you find running backs are like, I want to tote the rock. I'm the number one guy. I won't accept a backup role. Daniel Adeboboye last season was in a tandem backfield with another Canadian, a true freshman named Fabrice Mukendi, who was actually slightly more productive than Daniel Adeboboye, who is the senior and had tenure. But he did not have a problem with taking a step back, being the mentoring role and the complementary back to Mukendi and helping his development, which I think is something that teams will look at and say, oh, well, this is a guy who's going to fit well in our locker room, who we can trust to stay committed, even if Andrew Harris is getting all the touches and the only thing he's doing is helping out on special teams early. That mindset aspect of being able to commit yourself to that part of the game is what separates a lot of very talented players from the all-time greats like John Cornish, who stuck through years as just a special teamer before becoming arguably the greatest Canadian running back of all time.
And Harris will be able to teach Adeboboye how to be a professional. And we've seen the impact that Harris has had with Brady Oliveira and Johnny Augustine in Winnipeg, both guys who, when they were given the opportunity by the Blue Bombers, Harris out with injury, the large part of that, took it literally and ran. And I think a big factor in that was them learning from Harris, seeing how he approaches being a pro football player day to day. And that will be critical in my mind for Adeboboye. He'll get a firsthand look at what it takes, not only to be a successful Canadian running back, but just to be a complete pro, because that's how Harris, maybe someone Winnipeg would argue, except for in 2021, approached his craft. There were some people that felt like maybe didn't have the same energy and commitment in 2021. That's maybe why he suffered injuries and missed a bunch of time. But the guy is a two-time Grey Cup champion, helped turn around his hometown franchise. And that's something that I'm sure Adeboboye is looking to do with his hometown franchise in Toronto. They don't need to get turned around because they were first in the East in 2021. But the Grey Cup part, I'm sure Adeboboye would like to contribute to.
I'm sure he does. I think there is a little bit of a parallel here between Adeboboye, Toronto kid, coming out of the FCS, a power runner, and Brady Oliveira, who did the same thing a few years ago with Winnipeg to go behind Andrew Harris. I think they are similar in some regards. I think they play in the same sort of style. They've had similar levels of success, although Oliveira is a little bit of the better player. I think there are parallels to be drawn between those two draft picks, and you're hoping, if you're Toronto, that you're getting what Brady Oliveira was able to offer the Blue Bombers last season in Harris's absence.
The next pick has come off the board in the second round, 16th overall. The Saskatchewan Roughriders select Zach Fry, offensive lineman, Western University.
We talked about their offensive line needs earlier and how anxious Rider Nation has been about that situation. Well, they get a guy here who can hopefully help them in that regard if they can get him right in some of the manners that aren't necessarily gameplay related. Zach Fry, coming into this season, was regarded as a guy who might have got that East-West Bowl invite that Deontay Knight ultimately received, who might have had NFL interest based on his size, based on the fact that he's a pretty good mover as a big mountainous man. And while he was extremely successful for Western last season, there is some serious concerns about his level of power, his ability to knock people back off the ball. And some of that stems from the fact that there are rumors that he is not as committed as he should be to the weight room aspect of football, getting in the gym, making sure he's as strong as possible. And when we saw him at the CFL National Combine, that was brought into sharp relief by the fact that as a offensive lineman with not the longest arms, he only put up 9 reps on the bench, which again, that's different from gameplay strength, but you see that issue in his game. You wonder what the potential for Fry is if in Saskatchewan they can get him committed, get him on the right program, really reshape his body in the way, thicken up his legs, get him stronger up top. Can he have a step forward at the next level in that regard that allows him to reach his potential?
That will be the hope for the Rough Riders, who did need some increased depth along the offensive line, and they don't get the guy from just up the road there, Noah Zare, the University of Saskatchewan, goes earlier in the second round to BC, but they get Fry, who it seems like they felt like was the next best offensive lineman on the board to go along with their first round pick, Samuel Emelis, the receiver out of LA Tech. So the Riders going receiver with Emelis in round 1 and Fry, offensive lineman, in round 2. And you mentioned how Fry is a smooth mover, but there are questions because of his low bench press total at the CFL Combine. didn't get to double digits. That's something that you need to see from an offensive lineman in terms of just checking the box. Like, heck, I was a quarterback. I did more than double digits, more than Fry did on the bench. So you need to get in there and show yourself that you're committed. And that's something that you shouldn't have an excuse for in Saskatchewan, which is a crazed fan base. Rough Riders fans are all around the country, if not all around the world. But more importantly for Fry, those facilities in Saskatchewan are top notch. So there will be no excuse for him not to be in there developing his strength physically, as well as what he's doing on the field with the coaching staff there in Riderville.
And let's make something clear. I don't think anybody really cares about your ability to bench as a metric, right? As far as combine testing goes, it's probably the most useless. It doesn't always translate, strictly speaking, from if you're putting up big bench numbers, you're especially strong on the field. It's not a one-to-one thing. But what it does demonstrate and what it is a metric for is how hard you're working, especially in the CFL draft where they're tracking guys for multiple years. This ability to, see, is he benching more than he did a couple years ago when we really liked him? Has he been putting in the work? And that's the concern with Noazaire.
Zach Fry, I think you mean.
No, sorry, Zach Fry. My apologies. Not the concern with Noazaire.
All right, let's make sure we got the right guy. We did, and moving on. The latest pick in the second round, 17th overall. The Hamilton Tiger Cats select Anthony Federico, defensive lineman, Queens University. JC, I know you got to look up close at Federico at the College Gridiron Showcase.
I did, and I really like this fit with the Ticats, who are a team that's going to start a Canadian defensive end in all likelihood. They brought in Micah Johnson. They still have Dylan Wynn. Ted Laurent somehow is sticking around there, but I don't think he's going to be starting for them. He'll be more of a rotational presence now. And that means Mason Bennett, who was their top pick a couple years ago, will be in the starting rotation. Anthony Federico can slide in right behind him very comfortably. He's very long. We've talked about arm length before, which matters a lot on the offensive and defensive lines. Anthony Federico has one of the longest arms in this class with 33-inch arms. So he's got that reach. He can long arm you. Once he extends, there's separation between him and the tackle, and he used it very effectively at the U Sports level. He got off the edge quick. He's got a good get off. He gets those arms out, and he's sort of, I would describe it as a clockwork rusher in the sense that he's doing the same thing over and over again, and it works. He'll get that extension, then he'll hit you with a late rip. He's got enough bend to come around the corner, and he racked up sacks like nobody's business at Queens with that move. Now, I don't think he has as many tools in his arsenal as you would like to see for a guy that you want to start early in his career. He's got that one that he's he does very well, but he needs some development in terms of how he can use his hands in other ways, get more comfortable with counters. But if you stick him there for rotational reps, or if Mason Bennett goes down in a game, you're going to be very comfortable with his ability to hold the point of attack, to be able to contribute in some regard. And he's going to be a big body who is fast enough and athletic enough in space to go down and be a mismatch on special teams, rack up some tackles in that regard. So a real nice fit here for the Hamilton Tiger Cats.
To balance it out a little bit, the Ontario University Athletics Conference split up into divisions because of COVID, essentially because they wanted to cut down on travel, and Queens romped through the East Division. That was by far the worst of the two compared to the West. And I wondered if there would be questions around Federico or any of the prospects coming out of that East Division, just due to the simple fact that there weren't really any great teams in there, honestly, except for Queens. They went 6-0 through the regular season, played Western in the Yates Cup, to be quite honest, got dominated. But Federico has clearly shown that despite the level of play that he went against last year, he's well above that. The Tiger Cats like to take high character guys. Orlando Steinauer, the man at the top, really preaches character in that locker room. So to me, that's going to be a critical factor here. He's clearly a smart dude if he can get into Queen's University. So that should help him out as well in terms of picking up Mark Washington's defensive playbook there in Hamilton. And you mentioned it, if they're going to go with Mason Bennett, and if he does in fact earn that defensive end spot, the starting role for the Ticats, then it's an area where the Ticats needed to create some depth after losing Connor McGough in free agency a couple of years ago.
They really did. It was a desperate need because behind Mason Bennett right now, you only have Malcolm Campbell, who was a later round pick a few years ago, has been very successful for the University of Toronto, but has not yet proven himself on a CFL field. So you want to get some guys who can get in that rotation, contribute at that spot. And Anthony Federico is that guy. Now, you mentioned the weak competition level in that East Conference in the OUA, and it's a very valid point and something you have to consider. I don't think it was something teams were overly concerned about with Anthony Federico for the simple reason that pre-pandemic in 2019, he was also extremely productive as a pass rusher. He was among the top guys in U Sports that season as well. So you saw that very earlier on in his career, he was able to produce at that level against better competition. And then through the pandemic, he stayed at least the same and got better, and then did it against weaker guys in the East Division. A lot of the prospects in this draft, you can't say the same thing about, because in 2019, when they were true sophomores, they weren't producing at a high level, nor should they be expected to, but they missed that junior season where a lot of guys break out that third year. Anthony Federico broke out much earlier, and he's a little bit of an older prospect as well. So you're not as concerned with the fact he had to play weaker guys this past season.
And he was at the College Gridiron Showcase, went against NCAA competition. And as you mentioned, decent amount of those guys from that showcase were drafted into the NFL. So there's that film out there on Federico as well. And went to the Buffalo Bills local pro day too. So a guy that was at least on the radar of NFL scouts. And you imagine, you look at the sheer numbers of guys playing football in Canada and North America and around the world, and you got to be at a pretty high caliber to even get invited to those local pro days. So Federico, a guy that clearly the Ticats put a value on to take in the second round. The next pick in this round has just come off the board. 18th overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Braden Brown, University of Alberta, offensive lineman.
This is another offensive lineman that I love, and it seems like I love all the guys that have gone off the board. But I think I love Braden Brown even better than his ranking on our list because he gets knocked down for some measurable things that are outside of his control. He's only 6 feet on stilts, as it were, and 280 pounds. He's very undersized for a professional offensive lineman, but he plays the center position as well as anybody at the U Sports level, played some guard as well, an all-Canadian player. We talked about Nathan Cherry, who was the BC Lions top selection in this draft at number 3 overall. When I spoke to him at the Combine, I asked him point blank, who is the toughest player in U Sports for you to play against? He said, without question, it's Braden Brown. That guy is a monster. He's so physical, and his natural leverage, because of how short he is, he's impossible to get past. And I think that's the advantage that he gets from his size that sometimes people will overlook, is he's got a tremendous anchor and he gets underneath guys. We saw it at the Combine. People were trying to rush Braden Brown in the one-on-ones, and they were stonewalled. He knocked Deontay Knight back in a one-on-one rep. That shouldn't happen, but that's how physical and how strong at the point of attack this kid is from the University of Alberta.
Yeah, I've seen it firsthand doing University of Alberta games for the Canada West Football Showcase in the Canada West Conference. My goodness, this dude is physical. He was doling out pancakes early on a Sunday morning at the University of Toronto with stunning regularity. Like he had multiple pancakes, JC, that wowed everybody that was on the turf there in downtown Toronto. So he was eating. He must have had his breakfast and was going for a second or third breakfast or something for the big fella, because he was getting after it there on the turf. And just take one quick second while we wait on the Edmonton Elks on the clock right now, second round, 19th overall. JC, we got some comments rolling in here from the people watching. The End Zone says, thanks for doing this. Cody Newman says, woot woot, clearly happy that we got the live stream going. Emily Sutton says she's watching from the US. Shout out, Emily. Steve W says CFL Draft for the win. I think we would both agree. The Wiggler says, thanks for doing this. And then we have Patrick Springer. I don't know if this guy is related to you in some form or fashion.
Oh, Patrick.
JC, but he said JCGOAT. GOAT.
That's a comment all the way from Germany. Patrick Springer is one of my colleagues at the All-22 Global Scouting Network. I was able to go down to the College Gridiron Showcase with Patrick. He came all the way from Germany to Fort Worth, Texas, to try his hand at evaluating some of these NCAA and U Sports players that were there. Just a tremendous guy.
And there's one other comment we'll get off here. MG says, Ottawa is overloading on positions. Going to have to cut some good players, specifically at receiver or offensive line. Hopefully don't get a bad rep with the players. So you see, that was something you mentioned in terms of how they have a lot of offensive linemen. But again, got to understand there's probably some things that we don't know, at least at that position right now, in terms of guys who could be injured or might be moving on to other things in life.
That's always true in this case. And I think one thing that we didn't mention about Radim Brown in that vein that's worth mentioning is part of the reason why he maybe falls here in the second round is because he's going to return to school to the University of Alberta next year. And that's the case with some of these draft picks, some that have been vocal about it and we know about, and then some other guys that might end up surprising us down the line. Now, the teams all know this. They know who are going to return to school and take that extra fifth year of eligibility that you get while playing U Sports, and it'll affect where they're drafted. So that is something to keep in mind with these players, is that most of them have remaining eligibility that they can either choose to take, or that teams sometimes with late developmental picks will say, please do take this because we don't have space for you right now, but we want to see what you can become.
To tag the pick of Brown going to Montreal, let's keep this in mind. The Alouettes have had 3 picks. None of them have any ties to Quebec in terms of either playing their university football there or growing up there. Number 1 overall, the Owls took Tyrell Richards, linebacker, Syracuse. Number 9 overall, they take Tyson Philpot, receiver, University of Calgary, and then Brown from the University of Alberta. So Machocha is showing he's actually living up to his public statements and saying that if there are players that are of equal grading on their draft board, they're going to take anyone in that instance that has a tie to Quebec. But if there's players on their board rated higher, that's where they're going to go. The first 3 picks for Montreal have no ties to the city there or Quebec.
Radim Brown especially is a bit of a journeyman. I think it's worth talking about his sort of history and past. He's from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which you love to see these maritime players. He moved to Saskatchewan so he could play high school ball against bigger and better competition. And then he ends up at the University of Alberta for his college career. Now he's in Montreal. So a guy who's crossed the entire country because of his desire to play football. You're sort of checking off every box here. And I think it's interesting that the Alouettes select him here just before the Edmonton Elks and the Ottawa Red Blacks have their territorial selections, because obviously Edmonton territorial at the University of Alberta, but most people don't know this. Any team in the East Division, it's a territorial selection if you're from the Maritimes. So Ottawa could have taken Halifax native Radim Brown with a territorial selection if they had wanted to in 2 picks time, but Montreal beats them to it.
Sneaky. That's part of what's at play here. You got to realize who's coming up after you, who you think might slip, who might not get to your next pick here. And you mentioned it, the territorial selections on the clock, Edmonton and then Ottawa to finish out this second round here, JC.
It'll be very interesting to see where these teams go because it limits it down to just people in your area. It's not the whole draft list you have access to. So Edmonton will be limited to people from Northern Alberta. I think probably the selection here will be Jaden Dalkey from the University of Alberta, who is a very physical all-Canadian safety. But then if you're Ottawa, and now here is something that we haven't talked a lot about, is this where Jesse Luketa from Penn State University comes off the board, a guy who was selected in the 7th round of the NFL draft by the Arizona Cardinals, but whose rights could be held by the Ottawa Red Blacks if they take him with this territorial pick.
And Luketa was close to going undrafted in the NFL. I believe it was less than 10 picks. We'll get to Ottawa in just a second because Edmonton has made their selection, territorial one at that. In the second round, 19th overall, the Elks choose Jacob Plamondon, defensive lineman, University of Calgary.
Wow, this is a surprise selection for me, especially this high in the draft. Plamondon was a guy who came through the regional combine ranks during this draft process, was not highly thought of necessarily before that, but got an invite to the national combine and showed off some very impressive physical metrics that you look for in a defensive lineman. He's 6'3", about 240 pounds, but what you really like about him is that he has a 6'9" 3-cone. So the 3-cone drill for the uninitiated is sort of a change of direction bend drill. And you look at this for pass rushers because it shows you when you get upfield, can they go around the tackle? Can they take the shortest route to the quarterback? Or are they a bit too stiff and have to go the long way? Well, Jacob Plamondon is a guy who can come down that corner, who can bend because he's under 7 seconds in that drill, which is the metric that you really like to see for high-level pass rushers. He hasn't had the production necessarily at the University of Calgary. He's sort of been a 3-sack-a-year type of guy, but has some of those traits that clearly Edmonton likes to get in their defensive line rotation, and is light enough that he can help on special teams as well.
Certainly a guy that goes off the board higher than a lot of people thought, but he's been a guy that was, I would say, a quiet leader for the University of Calgary, part of that championship team in 2019 that won a Vanier Cup, and the Calgary program just continues to turn out pro prospects at all kinds of different positions. And I felt like Plamondon kind of went under the radar in a lot of ways. Yeah, maybe he doesn't have the sack numbers that are going to wow you, but was always stout against the run and was never a guy that was getting run over per se. He was always holding his own, competitive dude from a program that is known to turn out guys that end up in the pros, and not just end up there, but end up having productive careers to various degrees. So the Elks go down the road to take Plamondon. Maybe that was a little shot back at Calgary, who had went up the road to take Josiah Shackle earlier in the round.
Perhaps it was. You mentioned that Calgary program has been very successful with defensive linemen. Plamondon has a very similar sort of profile to a guy who rose up into a first-round selection in Connor McGough. Now, Connor McGough was, I think, a higher motor guy, far more successful at the collegiate level in terms of his production, but their physical profile in terms of what they were able to do in combine testing looks fairly similar. Now, McGough was a little bit faster in terms of distance speed, but that change of direction, that ability to bend is the things you look for, and Plamondon matches it with higher profile guys like Connor McGough.
Yeah, and Matt Barry, the defensive coordinator there at the University of Calgary, has developed a penchant for having guys that are pro-ready coming out of his program, and that's part of the reason why I think guys get bumped up the board, is because pro scouts and coaches end up developing a relationship with a guy like Barry, who they know has developed guys in the past and trust what he says. They trust that he's telling them the truth about the upside and what the guys have been like in terms of their study habits and their approach to football. It's a very pro type approach there at the University of Calgary. It's no nonsense. Wayne Harris, the head coach there, doesn't put up with much. He's not a big talker, and he's the type of head coach that you don't want to disappoint. So when you talk to Harris and you talk to Barry, I feel like these coaches and scouts from the CFL and even the NFL will get a very real take on those players. And I'll give you an example. Dean Leonard, who was selected in last year's CFL draft by the Tiger Cats, I believe was in the 3rd round, J.C., correct me if I'm wrong, but he ends up getting selected in the NFL draft this year after playing 2 seasons at the University of Mississippi, more commonly known as Ole Miss. And I remember talking to Barry and him telling me that Leonard has NFL ability, and that's when he was at the University of Calgary as an outstanding defensive back, a lockdown dude on the short side of the field. So in my mind, that relates to this pick because Edmonton would have had relationships with Barry, or at least, the very least, conversations about Plamondon and making this pick higher than some people thought.
Yeah, those recommendations for college coaches, I think, carry more weight than the average fan appreciates. These guys know each other, right? The football community in Canada is not the largest one. It's an intimate one, right? These college teams, these pro teams, the scouts, the coaches, they know each other. They're in these cities consistently speaking to each other. And when a guy you respect says, hey, look, I know nobody's talking about this player, but he's somebody that you need on your team. Like, he's got this. These are the situations behind the scenes. He's done all this extra stuff for our program. That carries a lot of weight and a lot of value. In particular, I think with some of the, the guys down the coaching staff list with the position coaches and the coordinators, whereas a head coach is a guy who, he promised this guy's mother that he was going to do everything he could to make the best life for him. Coordinators and position coaches haven't made that commitment. They're going to tell you about the guys that they really like and think can bring value to your team.
And the final pick in the round has come off the board in the 2nd round, 20th overall, with their territorial pick. The Ottawa Red Blacks select Jesse Luketa, defensive lineman / linebacker, Penn State University, J.C., proving to be prophetic.
This could prove to be, if the cards fall in Ottawa's favor, one of the steals of the draft. Now, we mentioned it earlier. Luketa was selected in the 7th round of the NFL draft, but there are people, analysts like Daniel Jeremiah, who's a very respected draft prognosticator and former scout, who thought he had 3rd round talent. Now, he falls in the NFL draft because he's a little bit stiff. He's not a great pass rusher as an edge defender. He's more of a run value guy, special teams guy, and there's not as much people don't covet that as much at the NFL level anymore. So he falls all the way to the 7th, almost goes undrafted. And you look at statistically what that means for his hopes to come to the CFL. If you were a 3rd round pick, you're looking at waiting at least 4 years, sometimes more. 7th rounder, this could be a year or 2. It really cuts down that waiting period if he's unsuccessful at making an NFL roster early or spends time on the practice roster. You could see Luketa earlier than you expect, and he can contribute, I think, at all spots along your defensive line because he is that physical. He'll have enough to rush off the edge in the CFL, which I don't think he brings a ton of value at the NFL level, but he's also strong enough to slide inside, in my opinion, and hold the point of attack as a 3-tech.
Luketa is the first example in this class of an NFL draft pick being selected in the CFL draft. And there's often debate and a lot of talk when it comes to the CFL draft of how high do those guys get taken. And really, it's a case-by-case basis, and it's a team-by-team basis, and it's a GM by GM basis in a lot of respects. But Sean Burke here goes with Luketa, a calculated risk because the guy is a 7th round draft pick, and might as well, to be honest, have been undrafted. And Luketa even admitted that he didn't talk very much to the Arizona Cardinals. He didn't expect them to be interested in his services. Nonetheless, he's still going to get a shot there. He'll go to training camp with the Cardinals. So, you probably won't see him for sure, I would say, in 2022, because even if he gets cut by the Cardinals, he'll probably wait it out. So be patient with him. He's a local product, went to the same high school as Neville Gallimore, who's been a star on the rise in my mind with the Dallas Cowboys, starred certainly at the University of Oklahoma. So you have that local tie in getting Luketa. And if he comes to the CFL, could be a guy, and JC, you were touching on this, that has a high value in the league because he's going to play special teams right away and probably be really good on them. And they can line up at multiple positions. So Luketa, super intriguing, was a guy. And I think Mr. Hodge had this stat that had more sacks at the Senior Bowl than he did in his entire career at Penn State. That's wild to think of.
That's absolutely true. And I point out the reason for this. And sometimes the Senior Bowl along the offensive line tends to go for deeper cuts, small school guys that they want to showcase to teams because they've been requested that may have high-end upside. And so he's not going against necessarily all the best tackles he could in the Senior Bowl, and he showed the ability to get around them. Now, Penn State, in that conference, he was playing much better competition. He didn't have the bend, was more of a run defender. But if he comes to the CFL, you're probably looking at something more similar to the competition he faced at the Senior Bowl in terms of the tackles he'll have to go against. His pass rush upside improves in Canada, and I think he can contribute in multiple ways.
Luketa was the last pick of the second round. So before we move on to the third round, let's run it down for you. Second round, 10th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Deontay Knight, defensive lineman, Western University. Second round, 11th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks select Cyril Hogan St. Don, offensive lineman, Laval University. 12th overall, the BC Lions select Noah Zare, offensive lineman, University of Saskatchewan. 13th overall, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Tyrell Ford, defensive back, University of Waterloo. 14th overall, the Calgary Stampeders select Josiah Shackle, linebacker, we'll say / defensive back as well, from the University of Alberta. 15th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Daniel Adeboboye, running back, Bryant University. 16th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders take Zach Fry, offensive lineman, Western University. 17th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats take Anthony Federico, defensive lineman, Queen's University. 18th overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Radim Brown, offensive lineman, University of Alberta. 19th overall, with a territorial pick, the Edmonton Elks choose Jacob Plamondon, defensive lineman, University of Calgary. And to finish it off, as we were talking a bunch about, the Ottawa Red Blacks select the guy that JC called. You called it, buddy. Jesse Luketa, defensive lineman / linebacker, Penn State University. Round 3 is already off and rolling. So JC, let's keep it going, buddy. The Edmonton Elks, 21st overall, take Mark David Bien-Ami, offensive lineman, Fresno State University.
Can you think of a more Chris Jones pick than this one? Because this is frankly an insane selection at the top of the third round, but we'll explain to you why Edmonton will make this selection. Mark David Bien-Aimé is 6'5" and 365 pounds is what he played at when he was down at Fresno State University. He was recruited by Jeff Tedford, former head coach of the BC Lions, when he went down there and had some success for that Fresno State program. But he didn't play early in his college career, only dressed for one game, and then hasn't played since 2019. Did not play during the 2020 COVID pandemic season, and then after graduating, returned to Montreal. He's working at a local women's shelter, so he has not played football in 2 years' time. I cannot tell you how good of a player Mark David Biename may be, because there is not tape that exists on him since high school. This is a massive projection, but the size and that pedigree that we talked about earlier in the draft in terms of Gregor Mckellar maybe going higher because he spent some time at Rice, that plays a factor here. There are not very many human beings on this planet as big as Mark David Biename, and very few that go to the NCAA. And so Edmonton takes a big swing here in a weak offensive line draft to see if they can get some value.
Indeed, literally a massive swing. Before we keep it going, JC, is there anything else you want to touch on with Biename?
Oh, I don't know. Is there anything I want to touch on? I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Just checking. You got it all out. All right, let's go to the 22nd overall pick in the third round. Keaton Brueggeling goes to the Ottawa Red Blacks, receiver out of Carleton University, 6'3", 205, absolutely blue, testing out of the water, but his production with the Ravens left something to be desired, although some of that is out of his control.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a real value pick here in the third round. Brueggeling, you mentioned, he's 6'3", he is 212 pounds, and he is faster and more explosive than Samuel Emilus or the Philpot brothers. He is better in every testing metric than they are at basically 3 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier. That is really good stuff for projecting to the next level, but did not contribute early in his Carleton career. I have trouble knocking him for that because he didn't get that junior season. And then this year, put up about 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, but maybe didn't have the best quarterbacking. I think if you're a team like the Ottawa Red Blacks and you think you can develop him into something special, he has all the athleticism, and his floor, I think, is Marco Dubois, who was drafted out of the University of Laval as a big receiver by the Red Blacks a few years ago, and at the very least became a tremendous special teams talent and a better receiver at the CFL level than he ever was in college.
That could be the case with his athletic ability, and a guy that if you're willing to put the development time it seems like the Red Blacks are willing to do that, could be a very intriguing dude as he goes along as a pro. Third round is rolling. With the 23rd overall pick, the BC Lions select Joshua Archibald, defensive lineman McGill, I believe one of your favorites in this draft, JC.
He's a really intriguing prospect, was far more productive before the pandemic, rushing off the edge at McGill, but gained some weight. Said he wanted to get heavier and get stronger to be a pro prospect, and found it just devastated his ability to get off the ball. So his production this year was not very good. He cut all that weight down. He showed up in Texas at the College Gridiron Showcase and really flashed as a pass rusher, showed things I didn't expect from him, was willing to do counter moves, was willing to try the spin. Somebody who is confident, sometimes bordering on cocky, but I think has not reached his potential as a pass rusher, and it still has enough strength to be able to move up and down the line if you need him to.
Certainly, and a guy that might have gone a little bit under the radar in this draft, with some of the higher end prospects generating more buzz, but that's why we got our guy JC Abbott here to break them all down. And Archibald, an intriguing talent. At 24th overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Vincent Forbes Montbleu, receiver, Laval University, the first pick by the Owls that has connections to Quebec in this draft.
He's a guy that fits really well, obviously, with the Quebec connection, but rose from the regional combine to the national combine with his showing. Tremendously athletic. He's a little bit short. He's only 5'10", but this dude is cut up. You see him with a shirt off. You wonder if he's an Abercrombie and Fitch model. He is just so strong. He can contribute at special teams despite his lack of size, and it's just really gutsy. I think a guy who can play in the slot if you need him to, who can catch the hard balls, was really sudden on those short routes, has good change of direction, good speed, and good strength. He's not going to get rubbed out if he faces press coverage.
Let's keep it going. 25th overall in the third round, the Calgary Stampeders select Dimitri Royer, defensive back, Western Illinois.
This was a guy who was added to this draft late in the process. He's older. He's 27 years old, but played high-level college football for both Charleston Southern and Western Illinois in the FCS. He was raised in Florida, but his father is from Quebec, a former hockey player. He's now a hockey trainer in Florida. So he got his Canadian citizenship through his father, and he is a physical dude. Comes downhill, fills the gap from the strong safety position. He's about 200 pounds. I don't know if he has the range to play up high at free safety, but I think he could be a guy that you transition to linebacker and is certainly going to play a lot on special teams.
We got one more viewer comment here. Nathaniel Durkin, who's a receiver actually at the University of Calgary, wants Gavin Cobb to be picked. So we'll see if he ends up going in this draft. In the third round, 26th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select another one of JC's favorite players. He got a handful of them, I think, in this draft. Defensive lineman Enoch Penny-Larea, McMaster University.
Now, he's going to be listed here as a defensive lineman because that's what he played at McMaster. But at 5'10", 217 pounds, he's going to play linebacker at the CFL level. And you like the projection here for him because this is a freakish athlete of proportions we don't see. At that 217 pounds, he put up 27 reps on the bench. He goes 10-7 in the broad, super explosive, and a 4.58 40 dunk, sideline to sideline speed, super explosive. He is actually from the United States. The first time this CFL draft, players who come from other countries who are playing at the U Sports level, who played their college football careers here, did 3 years and graduated from those programs, are now eligible to be Canadian in the NFL draft for the first time. So Penny-Larea is born in Ghana. He was raised in New York City. His father actually works for the United Nations. He started out his college career at Union College in New York State, a Division III school, as a running back, and then decided, because he had a Canadian friend at that school, that he was going to try his hand at coming up to Canada, play defensive line for the McMaster Marauders, and showed his athleticism with just incredible sideline to sideline chase down speed. Now he's going to be a special teams demon for the Argos.
Really high caliber athletic dude. 27th overall in the third round, the Saskatchewan Roughriders go offensive line for the second straight pick of their own. Diego Alatorre, offensive lineman, University of British Columbia.
While you want to talk about my favorite guys, this is a dude I got to watch a ton as a UBC student, and the hype surrounding him when he came on campus, Dunk, was like nothing I've ever seen. He comes from Mexico, another one of these foreign nationals who has been Canadianized. He was recruited out of the International U18 Championships by Blake Nill, and Blake Nill called him the best offensive line prospect he had recruited since Suk Chung, who, as we know, turned out to be a CFL All-Star. This guy had hype like you wouldn't believe. I talked to the athletic director from UBC that year at a mall. I ran into him, and Gilles Lepin said, the first thing he said to me was, "Have you seen this Mexican kid? He's going to be special." He turned out to be a fantastic player, started at tackle as a freshman for that UBC Thunderbirds team. At left tackle, they had Dakota Shepley, who's in the NFL now, as the right tackle. They didn't trust Dakota Shepley to protect the blind side for Michael O'Connor. They trusted Diego Alatorre. He's since moved inside to guard, was a Canada West All-Star last year. I think he's a center at the next level because of his short arms, but super athletic, really nasty inside, and I think is going to be a great pro.
Let's find out if JC Abbott has done his homework here with the next pick. 28th overall in the third round, the Edmonton Elks select Peter Adjei, long snapper, Queen's University.
I have. Peter Adjei is on my list. We did our specialist rankings as well. He's a big body dude, 6'2" or almost 6'3", 220 pounds. He contributed quite a bit as a tackler downfield. He's got some good athleticism in that regard, and certainly a position that the Elks needed desperately. Zach Greenberg is the only long snapper on their roster, and he was a guy who was on and off practice rosters last season as part of the COVID protocol.
29th overall in the third round, the BC Lions select Ryder Varga, linebacker, University of Regina, a guy that if he wasn't going back to school, JC, would have gone much higher, and I think could have had a chance to go in the first round. This dude is a flat-out stud.
He absolutely is. I think he would have gone much higher, but is returning to school, as you mentioned, and you love his versatility and his first step quickness. My favorite part about Varga's game is his ability to blitz and contribute as a pass rusher. We talk about some of these things like use of hands, moves, having a pass rush plan while we talk about defensive ends. Well, Ryder Varga, when he blitzed off the edge for the Regina Rams, I think he had a better pass rush plan and more moves than almost any defensive end in this class. Now, he's not going to do that a ton at 229 pounds at the next level, but he can contribute as a blitzer, and some of those things will translate in how he comes down the field on special teams.
All right, that does it for the third round, so let's run through it one more time for those who are just joining. To start the third round, 21st overall, the Edmonton Elks selected Mark David Bien-Aimé, offensive lineman, Fresno State. 22nd overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks took Keaton Brueggeling, receiver, Carleton University. 23rd overall, the BC Lions chose Joshua Archibald, defensive lineman, McGill University. 24th overall, the Montreal Alouettes selected Vincent Forbes Montbleu, receiver, Laval University. 25th overall, the Calgary Stampeders take Dimitri Royer, defensive back, Western Illinois. 26th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Enoch Penny-Larea, defensive lineman, but more likely a linebacker in the CFL, McMaster University. 27th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders take Diego Alatorre, offensive lineman, University of British Columbia. 28th overall, the Edmonton Elks take a long snapper, Peter Adjei, Queen's University. And 29th overall, the BC Lions select Ryder Varga, linebacker, University of Regina. And to start the fourth round, wouldn't you know it, Nathaniel Durkin called it. He wanted to see Gavin Cobb go, and Mr. Cobb goes to the Elks, 30th overall, out of the University of Manitoba, also by way of Simon Fraser University.
Yeah, Durkin, another guy who started his career at Simon Fraser and transferred to U Sports, just like Cobb. Cobb is super small. He's 5'9". He's only 170 pounds. By any logic, he shouldn't be seen as a prospect in this draft based on size, but he is a special athlete. A 41-inch vertical. You look at that speed, 4.55 40. The dude is explosive, contributed at every level. And here's a fun fact about Gavin Cobb. Back before he was ever at Simon Fraser University in 2016 as a player for Mount Douglas High School on Vancouver Island, he was voted the BC High School AAA MVP. Now, there's two divisions in BC high school football. There's AAA and AA. Who was the AA MVP that same season?
Chase Claypool?
It was, in fact, Chase Claypool. Gavin Cobb and Chase Claypool were the two MVPs that season. That's how good he was in high school to be in that same conversation. I think he'll be able to contribute as a returner right away as well at the CFL level.
What a pull there. Got lucky on the spot. Claypool and Cobb in the same breath. And for people who don't know, and I don't know who wouldn't that would be tuning into this, but Chase Claypool, of course, starring with the Pittsburgh Steelers, was taken in the second round. In his NFL draft year, I believe that was 2020, has spent 2 seasons there in Pittsburgh. And Cobb, the former BC high school MVP, goes in the fourth round, 30th overall to Edmonton. Next up, the Ottawa Red Blacks, with the 31st overall pick in the fourth round, take Daniel Valente, defensive back, Western University.
he's got some issues in terms of his frame because he's only 171 pounds. You like guys a little bit thicker, but you are not going to find a dude who's smarter as a football player in this draft than Daniel Valente. There are times where he is reading a quarterback like not just a book, because a book would be too complicated, like a magazine. That's how easy it is for him as the safety for the Western Mustangs. He'd bait them, he'd pick them off. When he drives on that football, he has the intention to score. If you look at Ottawa, a team that's going to have some competition for their starting safety spot this year, Daniel Valente is a guy who is going to be in that mix.
Certainly could be. He's a very smart dude, was one of the leaders of that Western defense that won a Vanier Cup in 2021, takes a lot of notes, helped guys get line up, was essentially a coach on the field for Paul Gleason, who was a defensive coordinator there at Western with the Mustangs. And the guy, Valente, that was in his final year of eligibility with the Mustangs and made the most out of it, rising up the draft board. With the 32nd overall pick in the 4th round, the BC Lions select Adrian Green, defensive back, St. Mary's University, who J.C. you had as a riser through the process.
I really did. Nobody expected Adrian Green to be in the conversation in terms of a high-level draft pick, but he showed up at the regional combine and just his silky smooth athleticism. He's got greased up hips for the corner position. Now he falls here to the 4th round because he wasn't necessarily dominant at the AUS level, and we've talked about that conference before. Only had one career interception, I believe, but locked down everyone on the combine circuit, moves really well, has great length and size for the position. And I think he fits in super well for the BC Lions behind guys like Hakeem Johnson and Jamie Harry, who are of sort of a similar ilk.
And 33rd overall in the 4th round, the Montreal Alouettes select Tyson Otis Copeland, defensive back, University of Montreal.
Otis Copeland was a guy I was exposed to a little bit late in the process. I sort of threw him on as a late rounder on my DB rankings, and I got a text immediately after that was published that said, no. This is a guy who's going to go far higher than you expect. He's got great size. He's a corner that's almost 200 pounds, and he's explosive when he comes downhill to make the tackle. He breaks on the ball. Special teams size, high projectable traits, and an existing relationship with Danny Machocha for their time at the University of Montreal with the Carabins. This seems like a natural fit here for a team that needs some depth in the defensive backfield.
34th overall in the 4th round, Jacob Butler, offensive lineman, Queen's University, goes to the Calgary Stampeders, a big body.
He is a big body dude. Now, this was somebody that I was a little bit lower on than clearly the Calgary Stampeders were. I didn't think Butler necessarily had sort of the high-end traits, the pop that I look for. He was a very physical power guard at the University of Queens, but we mentioned before, didn't play the best competition level last season in that East Conference. But I think he played right tackle. Maybe as he moves inside to guard, some of his movement limitations will go away and he'll have a more successful stint in the CFL. I know Calgary has taken sometimes these lesser known offensive linemen and had some success.
35th overall in the 4th round, the Toronto Argonauts select Braden Knoll, offensive lineman, Wilfrid Laurier University.
I had Knoll ranked above Butler just because of his versatility. He played up and down the line at Wilfrid Laurier, just about every position, tackle and guard. I think he can show you some versatility at the CFL level as well, has that lateral quickness that you look for. Maybe not a high-end offensive line prospect in a normal year, but in this draft, you take him this highly because you're not going to get very many other prospects lower down on the board.
36th overall in the 4th round, the Saskatchewan Roughriders select Tommy Bringy, linebacker, Wilfrid Laurier. Back-to-back picks for the Golden Hawks.
Yeah, Tommy Bringy is a dude with tremendous size, really good length for the linebacker position. So he can get off blocks on special teams, just extend and shed, will contribute in that regard early. Maybe doesn't necessarily have, sideline to sideline range to become a starting linebacker, but is super physical. I think smart, plays faster than he tests because of that anticipation, and will bring you some early value on those special teams that Coach Craig Dickinson loves so very much.
37th overall in the 4th round, the Hamilton Tiger Cats select Keandre Smith, receiver, University of Guelph. And the connection here that I think maybe played a role, Orlando Steinauer played with his father, Adrian Pee Wee Smith, on the tour with the Argos.
Very interesting. I didn't know that little tidbit, but of course, the Guelph Griffins better than anybody as a Griffins legend. Keandre Smith, I thought, showed very well at the National Combine. He's, I would say, a little bit of a looser athlete. He's not necessarily as put together as a route runner as everybody else, but still very sharp and explosive out of his breaks, out of his cuts. He was an all-Canadian return specialist for Guelph. I'm not necessarily sure he has the long speed to do that at the CFL level, but can certainly have the traits that you can refine to be a complementary receiver for this offense.
He's got that pedigree. Pee Wee Smith is in his blood. So you'd imagine he's got the opportunity to be productive in the CFL just because of that. And we saw Pee Wee Smith have that return ability in the CFL as a defensive back, right, my man?
Yes, we did. Matt, he's only got about 4.6 speed, so I don't know if that's CFL return ability, but I've been surprised before. Sometimes it's all about, how you play those angles and your vision in the open field. Some guys have it, some guys don't.
We'll find out with his son. Keandre Smith comes off the boards of the Hamilton Tiger Cats, so Pee Wee Smith going to have to cheer for the rival there in retirement. 38th overall in the 4th round, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Cole Adamson, defensive lineman, University of Manitoba.
Adamson, I thought, performed well at the National Combine. He is not going to be a sexy selection. This is a run-stuffing defensive tackle, but Winnipeg needed somebody of that ilk. Now, they went out and made a trade today where they got Cam Lawson, which helps them get some depth behind Jake Thomas. But Adamson can be that third guy. He's a local product. And here's my sneaky assessment of him. Some of his strength at the point of attack and the way he moves. I wonder if there's a future for him on the offensive side of the ball, like we've seen some defensive linemen be converted. I don't know if anyone else has that opinion, but that's just something I saw in the way he plays the game.
Adamson, of course, from Oak Park out there in Winnipeg, and that is an intriguing situation. The Bombers go get a hometown dude. So the 4th round is over. We'll run through it one more time to make sure you're up to date. With the 30th overall pick, the Edmonton Elks select Gavin Cobb, receiver, University of Manitoba, and Simon Fraser. 31st overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks take Daniel Valente, defensive back, Western University. 32nd overall, the BC Lions take Adrian Green, defensive back, St. Mary's University. 33rd overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Tyson Otis Copeland, defensive back, University of Montreal. 34th overall, the Calgary Stampeders take Jacob Butler, offensive lineman, Queen's University. 35th overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Braden Knoll, offensive lineman, Wilfrid Laurier University. 36th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders take Tommy Bringy, linebacker, Wilfrid Laurier University. Back-to-back picks there for the Hawks. 37th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats take Keandre Smith, receiver/returner, University of Guelph. And to cap it off, in the 4th round, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, 38th overall, take Cole Adamson, defensive lineman, University of Manitoba. Round 5 is off and going. To start it, JC, the third set of twins in this draft come off the board, 39th and 40th overall, respectively. First of all, we'll talk about Wesley. The Edmonton Elks select Wesley Apollon, linebacker, Tuskegee.
Here's the surprise for me is I actually thought Woodley would go first, but here they go back-to-back picks, and Wesley is the first one off the board. Maybe reminiscent a little bit of the Herdman twins when Jordan Herdman was considered to be sort of the better college player, and then Justin Herdman was actually drafted first. A little bit similar here. Now, Wesley Apollon, he's 6'4". He's a little bit heavier than his brother at 225, 230 pounds. And he actually played a little bit of corner at the junior college level and has the versatility to move inside to linebacker. That's the type of athlete Chris Jones is going to love. Maybe like a Kevin Francis where he can move him all over the place, maybe move him down to even defensive line with some of the length that he has. I thought he was stiffer than Woodley was and not quite as high of a football IQ, but certainly as able to play in space at a high level.
And 40th overall, his brother Woodley Apollon goes to the Ottawa Red Blacks linebacker Tuskegee.
Yeah, so Woodley started out in JUCO just like his brother. They played together. Woodley was a safety at that level and then went as a safety to the University of Northern Illinois at the Division I level. Only played one game in one season there, didn't record any statistics, but then went to play with his brother alongside each other in that Tuskegee linebacking core. And I thought he was the smoother mover of the two. He was a little bit better in space, and I thought he played with some anticipation, was able to fill against the run with some force. He'll be a great special teams player for the Red Blacks, if nothing else.
41st overall in the 5th round, the BC Lions select Riley Pickett, defensive lineman, University of Saskatchewan.
The third defensive lineman off the board for the BC Lions and the third Saskatchewan Husky that they take. They clearly like that program and the physical edge that they play with, and there is nobody more physical than Riley Pickett. I thought he was a big game player for the Huskies, showed up when they needed it, and just a ferocious bull rusher. So powerful, not necessarily refined as a pass rusher, but will put you on your butt and penetrate against the run. I think he can actually transition inside if he puts on a little bit of weight at the CFL level. He's 250 pounds right now. Maybe if he's a little bit heavier, he can play D-tackle, but has some versatility and will be able to contribute on special teams.
Pickett is just a high energy dude. I've been around him a lot covering that Huskies team in recent years for the Canada West football showcase on TV out west, and every time I talk to that guy, I just get hyped up. It's like I want to suit up and go play on his team, man. He is a high energy guy, and he'll certainly bring that to the BC Lions. 42nd overall in the 5th round, the Montreal Alouettes select Reef Jean Giroux, running back, University of Montreal.
Another regional combine guy who rose in this process, but Danny Machocha didn't need any information on him. In the late rounds, he's going back to his Quebec strategy, and he knows this guy well, having recruited him to the Carabins. He was a starting caliber running back early in his career for them. He was a all RSEQ selection as a kick returner. Now his measurables across the board are sort of middling. He's, average size, average athleticism. But what you saw on the combine circuit and some of the tape is that he is stout as a blocker. Just absolutely a tough as nails running back for his size, can contribute in that regard, can do it on special teams, will go down the field and do the hard work. And he's got a little bit of wiggle as a route runner as well, which I didn't expect to see from him.
43rd overall in the 5th round, the Calgary Stampeders select Joel Braden, offensive lineman, University of Regina.
This is a big body. He is massive coming out of the CJFL ranks. Joel Braden is 6'4", 350 pounds. That's a big boy playing at the CFL level. Doesn't always translate well when you're that size, and he's got some stiffness. He's not the best mover, but you look at that, and you can't find those bodies very often anywhere in the world. He played at a high level for the Regina Rams at his size, is a worthy project for the Stampeders here at this stage in the draft because there's not very many offensive linemen left on the board.
44th overall in the 5th round, the Toronto Argonauts select Daniel Kwemu, linebacker, University of British Columbia, right near you, JC.
He is near me. Now, I was not always enamored with Kwemu. He's somebody who came on a little bit late in his career. I don't think he stood out in the same way, but has tremendous special teams value, sort of dips underneath blocks. And there are guys in the league who really like him. I think this is a good fit in Toronto, where he's going to be able to come down the field on special teams. And they've got an athletic group in that linebacking core now with Trevor Hoyt, Penny Laria, and now Daniel Kwemu. With some of that lateral quickness, he'll be able to help them out on special teams.
45th overall in the 5th round, the Saskatchewan Roughriders select Tristan Fleury, defensive back, McGill University.
I really like Fleury, and I begrudgingly left him out of my DB rankings to put Tyson August Copeland, who you've already seen selected in this draft, on there. But I think Fleury is a dude who can contribute at safety. He's got a little bit of a bigger body. He's about 190 pounds, 6'1". I thought he was smart at the position. I thought he was a good tackler. And I think he's got the ability to contribute on special teams due to his size.
46th overall in the 5th round, the Hamilton Tiger Cats select Jared Beeksma, linebacker, University of Guelph.
This is an absolute steal, isn't it, Dunk? I know you love Beeksma as a Guelph guy, another dude who came out of the regional combine process, and I thought really stood out. He moves well. He's 6'2", 215. He's not lost in space at all. He's got the change of direction. He can take on blocks. He can dip underneath. He plays with anticipation and intelligence. I'm shocked that Beeksma falls this far, because I thought he was a dude who could really help a team on special teams early in his career. And some people thought he could go as high as the 3rd round because of it.
Beeksma is just a flat-out stud, man. He's a leader of that Guelph defense under defensive coordinator Dennis McPhee, who challenges his guys and runs a very pro-style scheme. McPhee has been the coach in the CFL for years, in between stints in U Sports, and is now, of course, at Guelph. I actually caught up with Beeksma a couple weeks ago and saw him up close in person again. I was like, man, this dude is cut up. He's a great leader, had a crew of Griffins with him. And I'm like, this is just the type of dude that you get in the mid to late rounds that comes in and adds to your core and makes you better instantly as a special teams contributor. And then in my mind, yeah, maybe athletically he's not super explosive and doesn't wow you, but I think he's got the type of lunch pail mentality and potential upside to maybe one day down the line develop as a starter. Might be a long shot, so people might laugh at that, but Beeksma just a high quality, high character dude, which Orlando Steinauer will love, and also Drew Alamang, who's one of their assistant general managers there that does the bulk of their Canadian scouting and just fits right in with the type of culture they like to build in Hamilton every single year.
Hard hat, lunch pail Canadian.
That's right. Great dude. Could be a high value pick in the 5th round. And to round out the 5th round, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers take Chris Sanguinu, 47th overall defensive back, University of Ottawa.
Tremendous length and athletic traits. Guy that's almost 6'3", 194 pounds, has the explosiveness with an over 10-foot broad, and 4'5", 40, 32.5-inch arms, which means he can reach in there and break up balls. Now, I don't think he showed as well on tape as necessarily those measurables will you would expect with those measurables, but has good burst downhill. I think can contribute on special teams and has some developmental upside for a team like the Bombers that needs more depth in the defensive backfield if they're going to start a Canadian safety.
And that does it for the 5th round. So let's run through it. 39th overall, the Edmonton Elks take Wesley Apollon, linebacker, Tuskegee. And 40th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks take his brother, Woodley, Apollon, linebacker, Tuskegee. 41st overall, the BC Lions take Riley Pickett, defensive lineman, University of Saskatchewan. 42nd overall, the Montreal Alouettes take Reith Jean Giroux, running back, University of Montreal. 43rd overall, the Calgary Stampeders select Joel Braden, offensive lineman, University of Regina. 44th overall, the Toronto Argonauts take Daniel Kwemu, linebacker, University of British Columbia. 45th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders take Tristan Fleury, defensive back, McGill University. 46th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats take Jared Beeksma, linebacker, University of Guelph Griffins. 47th overall, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers finish off the 5th round by taking Chris Sanguinu, defensive back, University of Ottawa. The 6th round is off and going. To get it started, the Edmonton Elks, 48th overall, select Jeremy Dominique, defensive back, Charleston.
One of the more fascinating prospects in this draft, as I'm sure you'll agree, Dunk. I got to speak to a chance to speak to Dominique in the lead up to this process. Did a in-depth interview with him. He's not a fan of me anymore because I ranked him 8th among my DVs coming into this draft. He wasn't a fan of that, but really a captivating individual when you speak to him. Uber confident. Some teams will really like that. Edmonton, I think, is one of those. Some teams won't. Has had a journeyman collegiate career. Started out at the University of Hawaii, then had a very serious injury. Almost lost his foot to an ankle injury and an infection. Was able to battle back from that. Transferred to the University of North Dakota for his year of recovery to be closer to home, and then transferred again without ever playing a game. But got caught up in the COVID pandemic confusion, ends up at Division II Charleston, where he was a very successful safety over, the short spring season and this last year. I think he shows well on tape. He has some the ability to have some range, come downhill as a tackler, play with anticipation. The athletic testing numbers, I think, are concerning. He had a pro day. He pulled his hamstring, didn't like those results, and then came back with a videoed pro day, which I think was questionable, to say the least. I think scouts would agree. Some people were scared off by that part of the process. But Chris Jones, it seems like his type of guy, high-end pedigree, a guy who can potentially exceed his draft position based on the way he plays the game.
49th overall in the 6th round, the Ottawa Red Blacks select Sabumi Oyasoro, linebacker, University of Calgary.
This is an interesting prospect because I think Sabumi Oyasoro, in terms of his first step quickness, has one of the best first steps in the draft. He's been able to contribute really well when he comes downhill at the University of Calgary. I am really concerned about his ability in space. I saw him at the College Gridiron Showcase. He struggled in transition when he was asked to be in coverage. He did the same at the National Combine. You see his change of direction numbers are not very good. So you wonder about his ability to play in a starting role at the next level. But certainly coming downhill on special teams, there's some value here.
50th overall, the BC Lions select Frederic Evayar, receiver, University of Ottawa.
Well, that's a misnomer because Frederic Evayard was a receiver, but he is no longer a receiver. He converted from wide receiver, Dunk, to defensive end this past season. And let me tell you, he doesn't really know what he's doing there. And I don't blame him because he's made that transition so late. But the projectable traits in terms of his length and bend and speed are the things you look for in a top tier defensive end prospect. And the Lions clearly are placing a high emphasis on that position in this draft. And they think they can develop Evayard into something special. At the very least, he'll contribute on special teams.
51st overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Peter Kozushka, offensive lineman, University of Alberta.
This is a big mountainous man, play on that University of Alberta Golden Bears offensive line that has produced so many top talents in recent years. You talk about Carter O'Donnell, you talk about Mark Corte, you talk about Raheem Brown earlier in this draft. Kozushka, I think, is a little bit stiffer than this. He's not particularly explosive. He's a big dude, and they don't always translate well to the next level, but he was also battling an injury at the Combine. We may have not seen the best of him at that event. So you wonder how that affected his stock. For the Alouettes here, they pair him up with Raheem Brown, who they drafted earlier in the draft. And I think a guy like Kajuska, based on the way that team plays, sort of downhill attacking with William Stanback, more of a power or inside zone scheme there, Kajuska can fit in that role and just get after people as a physical downhill lineman.
52nd overall, the Calgary Stampeders take Rashid Tucker, running back, Queen's University.
Rashid Tucker at Queen's University, you talk about how Anthony Federico dominated on defense in that week conference. Well, Rashid Tucker did the same on offense. He is among the fastest running backs here, the fastest running back in this draft. I think he's a little bit slight in terms of his frame. That's probably why he falls here. He's taller than a lot of running backs at 5'11", but he's only 190 pounds, which typically, if you're 190 pounds as a running back, you want to be in that 5'9" area. He's taller and thinner, but he shows some smoothness as a route runner out of the backfield, and he keeps his legs churning. If you can add some good weight to his frame, I think there's potential there.
53rd overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Eric Sutton, defensive back, Texas State.
Fascinating prospect here. Eric Sutton is 5'9". He's 170 pounds, but he started for Texas State and he started at Southern Methodist before that, SMU, down at the Division I level at their sort of nickel corner, slot corner position. So he has a tremendous amount of high-level football experience, but does not have the frame that you necessarily want for a pro prospect. And you wonder where he projects on your roster, right? He's not necessarily big or long enough to play outside at corner. He's not a safety. The nickel role would be most similar to a Sam linebacker, but he certainly doesn't have the heft for that. So it'll be interesting to see where the Argos play him. But he has that short area quickness that you like to see. And while he exaggerates some of his accomplishments, he has a pedigree going back from his father, who was a successful CFL defensive back, and he's shown he can do it against top-level NCAA competition.
54th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders select Jaden Dalkey, defensive back, University of Alberta.
What are the odds here that Jaden Dalkey becomes Rider Nation's new favorite special teams player? I think it's pretty high. A kid from Leduc, Alberta, who originally played for the Edmonton Huskies in the Canadian Junior Football League, played out his eligibility there, was an all-Canadian junior football player at safety, and said, no, I'm going to go to the University of Alberta and become an all-Canadian safety at that level as well, which isn't easy to do. He is super physical, maybe not rangy enough to start at safety, but man, this guy comes downhill and he hits you like a hammer. So physical and will instantly help you on special teams.
55th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats select Kadeem Pierre, defensive back, Concordia University.
Another guy who's pretty physical. Now, I would have liked to have seen more of Kadeem Pierre. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to test fully at the combine because of an injury, but he's always been the hammer, not the nail at the collegiate level. And you like to see that when you're late in these CFL drafts, trying to take guys who have developmental upside, but special teams ability right now. Kadeem Pierre is one of those guys. And I think he could surprise some people. I liked what I saw from him on tape in terms of his ability to drive on the ball, to come out of his pedal with quickness. And he showed more speed than I expected once he picked off a few passes.
56th overall, to finish up the 6th round, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Jeremy Kapelensky, defensive lineman, University of Guelph.
This is another one of your beloved Guelph Griffins there, Dunk. Kapelensky is a guy maybe not a lot of people are familiar with in this process. More of a depth defensive tackle in terms of our ranking, but a high effort guy, in my opinion. He has some passable traits in terms of what he was able to do at the regional combine, but sort of came up field out of his rush and worked, got some hustle plays out of him in that regard. Maybe not the longest arms or the best measurables, But a dude who at 282 pounds, you wonder if that effort level will help him to contribute in areas on special teams that maybe other guys at his size wouldn't be able to do.
And he's probably liked just a little bit more by general manager Kyle Walters and head coach Mike O'Shea, both University of Guelph alums. So they go back to their alma mater for the first time in this draft to get Kapelinski to close out round 6. Let's run it down for you real quick so you're up to speed if you're just tuning in. In the 6th round, 48th overall, the Edmonton Elks started it off by taking Jeremy Dominique, defensive back, Charleston. 49th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks take Sabumi Oyesoro, linebacker, University of Calgary. 50th overall, the BC Lions take Frednik Avayard, defensive lineman, University of Ottawa. 51st overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Peter Kajushka, offensive lineman, University of Alberta. 52nd overall, the Calgary Stampeders take Rashid Tucker, running back, Queen's University. 53rd overall, the Toronto Argonauts take Eric Sutton, defensive back, Texas State. 54th overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders take Jaden Dalkey, defensive back, University of Alberta. 55th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats take Kadeem Pierre, defensive back, Concordia University. And to round it out, 56th overall, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Jeremy Kapelinski, defensive lineman, University of Guelph. The 7th round is off and going. The Edmonton Elks kick it off. 57th overall, Jean-Paul Samakinda, running back, University of Ottawa.
When I describe JP Samakinda as a bowling ball, I want all our viewers to understand this is not an exaggeration. He is physically very round. He's 5'11", 237 pounds as a starting running back for the University of Ottawa. Started out at the University of Guelph and transferred to the Ottawa GGs. You'd think he'd play more of a power game at that size, but he thinks he's a speed back, and he'll show you some wiggle. Now, the athletic testing numbers were not very good at the combine for his size. You know, the change of direction was concerning, and the 40 was respectable at 4.88, but certainly not elite. But if you look at his size and what he's been able to accomplish as a pure running back, I'm sure Edmonton will say, well, if he'll take on a more physical role as a fullback, what sort of value can he bring at that size?
And we're going to find out at that level. 58th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks take Connor Ross, tight end, St. Francis Xavier.
This is a big, big dude. You see here, he's 6'1", 250 pounds, played primarily as that tight end, could be your H-back or fullback. He's got a little bit of route running ability to catch passes. I don't think he's sophisticated in any regard. But what he also brings is the fact he's a long snapper as well. So that's something he can potentially help out with for the Ottawa Red Blacks, on top of his ability to be a physical blocker and a sneaky route runner at tight end.
59th overall, the BC Lions take John Mechie III, receiver, University of Alabama. And I'm just dumbfounded that Mechie would even get picked. But alas, he's off the board in the CFL draft after going in the 2nd round to the Houston Texans in the NFL draft.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking. I'm pretty certain we'll never see John Mechie play on a CFL field. He is that good. I don't think his bust potential for the NFL is particularly high. But if you're at the BC Lions at this point in the draft, I think they've had a stellar draft thus far. Maybe this is more of a publicity pick, as it were, to try and get some hype around that team. Hey, we picked John Mechie, who everyone knows is the 2-time John Cornish Trophy winner, as the best Canadian player in the NCAA.
Won a national championship with the University of Alabama following the 2020 season. And in 2021, if he didn't get hurt in the SEC championship game, you could argue that the Crimson Tide might have gone back-to-back, but the University of Georgia beat them with Mechie III on the sideline in the CFP national championship. But Mechie III, by all accounts, looks like one of the surest bets to be a productive NFL receiver, can play in the slot, can play it wide out, had multiple 1,000-yard seasons there for the Crimson Tide in the best conference in the NCAA, the SEC. And Nick Cesario, the general manager there for the Texans, comes from that New England Patriots line of thinking with Bill Belichick, and Belichick and Nick Saban, the head coach for the University of Alabama, are closely linked and have a tight relationship. We've seen a lot of Bama players been picked by the Pats, so it makes sense that Cesario would take Mechie the third, but I just can't understand why the Lions would, in this regard, waste a pick here. Yes, it's a bit of a publicity stunt, but you could have taken this guy later on in the draft if you really wanted to grab him. The Lions have a pick in the 8th round, and there's still guys that can help you out. And the Lions, other than the Elks, were the worst team in the West Division last year. So in my mind, I just don't understand what is essentially a throwaway pick, because Mechie III is going to, at minimum, make millions of dollars from his rookie NFL contract and going to have to absolutely be a complete bust to ever want to play in the CFL. Moving on.
Yeah, it is certainly a bit of a head scratcher.
60th overall, the Montreal Alouettes select Yanis Chihat, linebacker, Laval University.
Another guy that I'm sure Danny Machocha is more familiar with than perhaps some other teams. He's listed here at linebacker. He played a lot at defensive end for the Laval Rouge et Or, 6'3", 233. He showed some explosiveness in his testing, a 4.9 40, which is something you'd like to see for a guy who plays along the defensive line with some strength. Showed the ability to spot drop at times, as a good frame, probably a special teams contributor here for the Alouettes late in the draft.
61st overall, the Calgary Stampeders select Shaquille St. Lot, defensive back, Maine.
I think this is a tremendous value steal here this late in the process. Shaquille St. Lot was a starter at the University of Maine. Now he falls because he's currently injured. He hasn't been able to test. He's coming off a serious lower body injury. But you look at some of the traits that he has physically. He has 33-inch arms as a cornerback, Justin Dunk. We've talked about that value for a defensive lineman in terms of being able to separate from an offensive tackle. But if you're a defensive back, if you lose a step on a receiver and you have 33-inch arms, you're gaining 3 inches on a lot of the corners that will be selected here in terms of your ability to stick your hand in there and knock down the pass. So the length that you like to see and a Division I starter, very rarely available this late in the draft. If he can get healthy, he's going to exceed this position.
All right, just before we get to the next pick, we have another viewer comment. This time it's a question from MG saying, do these players have to be signed? If so, could BC be trying to avoid some cap? Obviously referring to the John Mechie III pick. And the players don't have to be signed. That is definitely up to the teams whether or not they want to bring those players into camp. And BC, by Mr. Abbott's calculations, has spent the least amount of money of any team in the CFL, and we believe the projected salary cap is going to be in and around $5.3 million. And I've talked to some people that say their actual projection is probably closer to $5 million. We have it at about 4.7 or 4.8, JC. But no, the players do not have to be signed. We'll keep it moving so we can stick to JC's great analysis. 62nd overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Chase Arsenault, tight end, McMaster University.
Guy from Durham, Ontario, who played his last year of high school in the States and then came back to McMaster University to play in Canada. I really liked him at the CFL Combine. I didn't go in with particularly high expectations, but for his size, I mean, you talk about a guy who is, 6'4", 237 pounds. He has tremendous bend, an ability to sink out of breaks, to fake you out as a route runner, to set up defenders. I think he brings great value. I'm not sure he's necessarily a butt kicker as a blocker, but he's functional enough as a leverage blocker to contribute as an H-back in your offense, give the Argos a unique body type to contribute for them.
63rd overall, the Saskatchewan Roughriders select Zach Herzog, defensive back, Hillsdale College.
This is one of my favorite players in this entire draft. Zach Herzog played for a tiny Division II school. He is undersized at 5'9". That's why he falls here to the 7th round. But he is, in my opinion, the best Canadian college football player that you've never heard of, because he was 100 tackles a season guy for the Hillsdale College Chargers as a safety, made plays all over the field, super intelligent. You can see the tape study. I compare him in a lot of ways, and this is a high comp for me, to Stavros Katsantonis, who is a guy who fell in the process because of his size, was a longtime starter at the University of British Columbia. And of course, Stavros Katsantonis had to start in the Grey Cup as a rookie for the Hamilton Tiger Cats because of injuries, and performed very well there, despite the fact that he's 5'9". Zach Herzog is a player in a similar mold, who has the athletic ability, who has the intelligence, that I think he can stick around with the Riders and potentially surprise some people down the line.
Clear man crush there from J.C., but let's
Big
keep
time.
moving. 64th overall, the Hamilton Tiger Cats select Nicholas Guay, offensive lineman, Laval University.
We talked about the lateral quickness that you saw from his teammate Cyril Hogan-Sandon earlier in the draft. Nicholas Guay tests very well, super athletic. You see that quickness to be able to get to the play side shoulder on the first step on his own zone block and things like that. I'm not sure he has the physical pop that some of these other prospects do, and that's why he falls here. But you have some projectable athletic traits that you can work with if you're the Ticats, and they've made a killing in the past taking athletic bodies they can develop on the offensive line late in the draft. A lot of times these have been defensive line converts, but I think Nicholas Guay can be of a similar mold based on the way he tests.
65th overall, to finish off the 7th round, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Cedric Lavigne, defensive back, Carleton University.
This is a guy who contributed mostly on the linebacking core for the Carleton defense, which has been very successful with players like Jack Cassar and Trevor Hoyt in recent years. But he was also the team's primary long snapper. He's got good size for that position and the athleticism. When you're starting on defense and you're long snapping, that says something about you as a player. And I think the Bombers get some value here. Mike Benson is a solid long snapper, but he's long in the tooth. So you get somebody who can come in and compete in camp and give you some versatility that maybe he makes the team as a linebacker slash DB special teams guy. But you have him in case of emergencies as a linebacker as well.
The final round of the 2022 CFL Draft is upon us, and the picks are flying off the board, so we'll keep it rolling. 66th overall, the Edmonton Elks select Nate Edwards, linebacker, McMaster University.
Nate Edwards is one of the top linebackers in the U Sports ranks, was uber successful in that role. Now, he's a little limited athletically in space, which is why he falls here, but certainly a guy who's going to give you downhill physicality on special teams. And I hesitate to say this because I hate when teams do it, but maybe he's somebody that you think, okay, he can't contribute in our linebacking core, but maybe he becomes a fullback. We make that a late transition in the process. Sometimes that happens. I wonder if that's a path that Nate Edwards can take.
We'll find out. 67th overall, the Ottawa Red Blacks select Luca Perrier, running back, Laval University.
Luca Perrier, he's big, physical. He's long for running back. I see special teams upside for him. He has a bit of a sloppy physicality to him. I'm not sure it's refined enough, but you see special teams upside. This late in the draft, you want big bodies, guys that can contribute. I think he's one of those guys.
68th overall, the BC Lions select Adam Wallace, defensive lineman, University of Ottawa.
Well, you see the size here. He's a big body, but I'm going to mea culpa here, Justin Dunk. We've done this for 3 straight years. This is the first time a pick has come across the board that I am unfamiliar with. I do not know anything about Adam Wallace here in the 8th round. I want to apologize to any major Adam Wallace fans watching. I have nothing prepared on him. So could be a good player based on the size. I'm not going to make an assessment on a guy I'm not familiar with, and this is one I'm not.
Fair enough. 69th overall, the Montreal Alouettes take Zach Lindley, linebacker, Western University.
Very slight as a linebacker, Zach Lindley is. Played sort of a coverage backer role for Western, but high effort, really, sideline to sideline range at that position. A hustle player who'll chase you down across the field. I know there were some people who thought he was the best player not invited to the National Combine. He certainly has some ability to contribute on special teams if he adds a little bit of weight.
70th overall, the Calgary Stampeders select Daniel Emeoko, defensive back, York University.
He was the fastest player at the regional combines, I believe, with a 4.54 40. I like him. He made my list of the top 20 defenders available in this draft. He's a little bit small, but smooth mover, an elite athlete in all regards. I think despite the fact he's a little bit smaller at 5'11", 180 pounds, I still think he can give you some special teams upside just with the effort and the speed with which he plays the game.
71st overall, the Toronto Argonauts select Michael Pizzuto, defensive lineman, University of Ottawa.
People seem to love these GGs. There's a lot coming off the board. Michael Pizzuto, 260 pounds as a defensive end, did not get an invite to the regional or the national combine, which I was a little bit surprised by because he was a East-West invite last season. But good size, good strength. I'm not sure he has a tremendous amount of upside as a pass rusher, but big bodies late in the draft are always a good thing to add.
3 picks left in the draft, 72, 73, 74, and in order, Saskatchewan, Hamilton, and Winnipeg left on the clock, and the Rough Riders have just made their pick. 72nd overall, they stay at home. Riley Borsma, receiver, University of Regina.
This is going to make a lot of people in that area happy. I know he was a popular player for the University of Regina. Now, Borsma has not yet reached his potential in my regard, or in my opinion, based on his athletic testing. We talked about Gavin Cobb earlier and how as a 5'9" player, he's got that 40-inch vertical, that explosiveness, that speed. Riley Borsma is right there with him in terms of his incredible testing measurables. So you see that at times in flashes on his tape. I'm not sure he was consistent enough at Regina, but he also had a lot of struggles with changes at quarterback last season. I know Josh Donnelly was hurt for a good stretch of that campaign, so he didn't get his chance to showcase himself as much as he could have, and then he wasn't able to perform during the one-on-ones at the National Combine like he showed so well at the regional. So I hope that he's a guy maybe that goes back to school, comes back next year, I think has some high-end upside for the Riders late in the draft because of his athletic traits, and can be a guy like a Mitch Pitkin who was from a local school and exceeded where he went in the draft.
Borsma is sort of an honorary Regina citizen, let's say, because he's actually from Kitchener, Ontario, and then ended up with the U of R Rams, but they've really taken a liking to him, and he's got explosive athletic ability. And you could see it when I was calling his games for the Canada West Football Showcase on TV out in the prairies. When they could get him the ball and protect the quarterback consistently, he really had an explosiveness in the open field. I didn't think he was as fast as running in the 4.5 range, but he put that time down, and it's gotten him drafted. The Hamilton Tiger Cats have made their pick, 73rd overall, Jackson Brown Cirillo, defensive back, University of British Columbia.
Similar here to Daniel Kwemu in a lot of ways, has some lateral quickness, some movement skills. I don't think necessarily dominated in the way some of the top UBC prospects have in recent years. But Blake Nill out here in Vancouver, if there's one thing he covets, it's tremendous athletes. And Jackson Cirillo Brown was sort of a coverage linebacker type, but you won't go wrong with a player like that on special teams late in the draft.
We're just waiting on the last pick. The CFL's version of Mr. Irrelevant, 74th overall, will be chosen by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and it is in. Connor Burtonshaw, fullback, Queen's University, is the final pick in the 2022 CFL Draft.
There are certain picks that warm your heart, the guys you sort of root for in the process, but you think, probably aren't going to get selected for this reason or that reason. Connor Burtonshaw, for me, is someone I fell in love with watching. He's a fullback at Queen's University, but really he's a special teams demon. He's not very big. He's not very long. I think people may question whether he'll be able to get off blocks at the next level. But he racked up, I think, over 30 special teams tackles as a fullback for Queens, coming down on punt team, on kickoff, just a high effort guy. I think they'll love him in Winnipeg based on that. How much character and effort and work ethic matter to that Bombers organization. It's why they've got the last pick in this draft, because they've won the Grey Cup now for 2 straight years. And I think he'll fit in right away.
Back-to-back Grey Cups for those Bombers. They certainly know what they're doing, and also in the CFL Draft as well. It got started with the Montreal Alouettes taking Tyrell Richards first overall, the linebacker out of Syracuse, and then the heartwarming pick, Connor Burtonshaw, ends at the fullback out of Queen's University, J.C. It has been over 3.5 hours on here. I don't know about you. I'm just guessing, because you're a big dude. We need to get hydrated. We need to get some food in us. Maybe hit the bathroom. So give me a quick thought on who was your favorite pick, who had a great draft of the teams. What was your quick strike lasting memory of this draft at first glance?
Well, it'll take some reflection to really get an accurate assessment. But I think what stood out to me in terms of a top pick, Zach Herzog, to me, is tremendous value. I've got a man crush on him. I think he'll exceed where he was drafted. Zach Pellihos at the top of the draft was one of my favorites as well. 2 teams that I thought really stood out. Now, they surprised me a little with some late round picks. Obviously, Adam Wallace was someone I was unfamiliar with, and then John Mechie. We talked about the question mark there. But I think at the top of the draft, the BC Lions did incredibly well at the top of the draft. I really liked some of the pieces they added. And then the Ottawa Red Blacks, to me, were another big winner. They didn't have a lot of needs, but I thought they added quality talent across the board, which the rich get richer in that regard, which I hope Ottawa Red Blacks fans can appreciate after how deflated and, depleted their Canadian talent was over the last couple of years, where Marcel Desjardins wasn't taking quality talent at every position available.
You powered through the iPhone ringer there, JC, but that's the scouts calling to trash our analysis. So I better get back to them. You crushed it. If people out there don't know, JC Abbott is an absolute rising star. You just saw him go through 74 prospects and knew literally every single one except for one. That's the first time in multiple years that that's happened. That's going to keep him up late at night. But JC, man, you absolutely crushed it. For all of the post-draft analysis, you got to keep it locked to 3downnation.com. John Hodge has been analyzing every single pick in written form. And of course, if you think it's so nice you want to see it twice or thrice, you can review the live stream. Over 3 hours and 40 minutes now of goodness about Canadian prospects coming into this league. And we got to support our Canadians because we don't want the ratio to go down. We won't even get into that here, but keep it locked to 3downnation.com for all your post-draft analysis, all the goodness. Myself, JC, John Hodge, and the crew will have lots of post-draft analysis leading into training camps and, of course, the 2022 CFL season. So saying goodnight and appreciate everybody tuning in, not just from Canada or the United States, but all around the world. Viewers from Germany and Mexico were on here. So I guess that's partly due to the global program. And Randy Ambrosie, should we say thanks?
Thank you, Randy Ambrosie.
Well, JC, my man, you crushed it. And to everyone out there, hope you enjoyed the coverage and have a good night. See you later.